Across the ancient Mediterranean, before the rise of Greece and Rome, an island civilization flourished whose echoes still ripple through myth and memory. On the shores of Crete, the Minoans built sprawling palaces of stone and light, their walls alive with frescoes of leaping bulls, blue dolphins, and sacred rituals. Their ships carried goods across the Aegean, weaving Crete into the fabric of Egypt and the Near East, long before the world would know the names of Athens or Sparta. Yet for centuries the Minoans remained forgotten, their language unread, their gods unnamed. All that survived were scattered legends of King Minos, the labyrinth, and a beast in the shadows. Some whispered that this was the true seed of Plato's Atlantis, a cousin to that lost world swallowed by the sea. Tonight, we journey slowly into their story, from the labyrinthine halls of Knossos to the buried city of Akrotiri, to scripts still silent after 3,000 years. This is not a tale of conquest or empire, but of mystery, beauty, and sudden silence. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let us walk together into the entire history of the Minoans, Atlantis' forgotten cousins. Chapter 1. Knossos, the Palace of Labyrinth Son. The sunlit slopes of north-central Crete, a city once stood that seemed less like a settlement and more like a dream in stone. The Palace of Knossos, sprawling across more than 150,000 square feet, was not only the largest of the Minoan palatial complexes, but the one most deeply entwined with legend. Here, beneath the Cretan sky, corridors twist into corridors, stairways rise and fall unexpectedly, and chambers spill into other chambers without clear order. To walk through Knossos is to feel that one has entered a living labyrinth, a place both real and mythic at once. When Sir Arthur Evans began excavating the site in 1900, he believed he had stumbled upon the very heart of the story told by the ancient Greeks, the palace of King Minos and the labyrinth of the Minotaur. Evans himself coined the term Minoan, giving a name to a civilization that had no voice of its own in recorded memory. His work revealed vast storage magazines lined with pithoi, giant clay jars that once held oil, wine, or grain, suggesting an advanced administrative economy. Yet the deeper he dug, the more the ruins seemed to echo with myth. The architecture of Knossos defies simple explanation. Unlike the rigid axial plans of later Greek temples, the palace unfolds like a maze, rooms layered upon rooms, staircases descending into shadowed recesses, light wells opening suddenly to the sky. There is no single front to the structure, no central axis to command its flow. Instead, it seems deliberately irregular, designed to confuse, to disorient, or perhaps to reflect a different concept of space itself. Was it a palace for rulers, a temple for priests, or a sacred city in miniature? The lines blur. At the center lies the Great Court, a broad rectangle that may once have hosted processions, festivals, or the famed bull-leaping rituals depicted on frescoes. Around this open heart, rooms spread outward, storerooms, workshops, living quarters, and shrines. Evans identified a throne room with a gypsum chair flanked by painted griffins, which he interpreted as the seat of a king. Yet others have argued the opposite, that the imagery and ritual features suggest a goddess or high priestess held precedence. The throne itself, modest and narrow, raises questions. Was it truly a throne of power or a seat of ritual significance? The frescoes of Knossos breathe with life still. Fragments pieced together reveal youths vaulting over bulls, women gathering in elaborate costumes, dolphins swimming through azure waters, and lilies blooming in vivid color. Unlike the martial reliefs of Egypt or the rigid stone carvings of Mesopotamia, Minoan art seems light, fluid, filled with movement and grace. Its subjects are not kings triumphant or armies victorious, but nature, ritual, and the human body in harmony with both. In this art, scholars glimpse a society perhaps less bound by hierarchy, more attuned to ritual and environment. Yet such impressions remain fragile, woven from fragments. Beneath the surface of beauty lies the enigma of destruction. Archaeologists have identified multiple phases of ruin at Knossos: fire, collapse, rebuilding, and fire again. Around 1700 BCE, the first palace was destroyed, perhaps by earthquake, only to be rebuilt on an even grander scale. Then, around 1450 BCE, catastrophe struck again. Was it the eruption of Thera that shook the island and sent tidal waves across the Aegean? Or did invading Mycenaeans from the mainland sweep through, toppling the centers of Minoan power? The evidence is tangled. Burned beams, toppled walls, scattered remains of once-ordered storage jars. Each layer speaks of ending, but not of why. Knossos continued in diminished form after the collapse, its final occupation extending until around 1200 BCE. But by then, the palatial civilization of the Minoans was gone. What remained was memory, reshaped and retold by the Greeks. For them, Knossos was the palace of Minos, a tyrant who demanded sacrifices to feed the Minotaur. The labyrinth, perhaps inspired by the palace's twisting halls, became a metaphor for entrapment, secrecy, and hidden danger. Was this simply myth woven from architecture? Or do the myths preserve a cultural memory of rituals long forgotten? Sir Arthur Evans, fascinated by these connections, reconstructed portions of Knossos with concrete and paint. His work has been criticized for imposing modern vision upon ancient stone, yet it also gave the ruins a vivid, almost theatrical presence. Visitors today walk through corridors painted with restored frescoes, climbing staircases Evans rebuilt, seeing a vision of the palace that is part original, part early 20th century imagination. This blending of ruin and reconstruction adds another layer of mystery. Are we seeing Knossos as it was, or as Evans wished it to be? Among the storerooms and chambers, archaeologists unearthed tablets inscribed with Linear A and Linear B. Linear B, when deciphered, revealed administrative records of Mycenaean Greek, evidence that mainland powers once controlled Knossos. But Linear A, the script of the earlier Minoans, remains undeciphered. These signs etched into clay preserve a language we cannot read, the very words of the people who built Knossos, forever sealed. In this silence, the palace seems both near and distant. Its walls speak in art and architecture, but its language refuses to answer. Some scholars view Knossos as the administrative heart of a centralized kingdom. Others see it as a ceremonial hub, a gathering place for ritual rather than political command. Still others suggest it was both, a palace that was also a temple, a place where lines between sacred and secular blurred. The abundance of storerooms and their massive jars speak of economic control. The frescoes and shrines speak of religious devotion. The labyrinthine design itself may reflect a worldview foreign to us, one that does not separate governance from worship. The myths of the labyrinth and the Minotaur, while Greek in telling, may hold echoes of these realities. A labyrinth that consumes those who enter, a bull at its center, human lives sacrificed to appease unseen powers. These images align with the prominence of bull imagery in Minoan ritual, the dangerous vitality of bull leaping, and the sense of mystery embedded in the palace's design. Was there truly a ritual of sacrifice remembered in distorted form? Or was the labyrinth only the metaphor by which later Greeks explained the strange and bewildering ruins of Knossos? To stand at Knossos today is to walk through both history and legend. The sun glints off gypsum blocks, corridors stretch into shadow, staircases rise to nowhere. In one room, jars line the walls, empty now, but once filled with sustenance for thousands. In another, fragments of frescoes show dolphins leaping eternally across blue seas. In the throne room, the seat of power sits silent, watched over by painted griffins, whose gaze has not dimmed. And yet, for all the excavation, for all the reconstruction, Knossos remains elusive. Its story is not complete, nor will it ever be. The palace is a palimpsest of destruction and rebuilding, of myth and history intertwined. Archaeologists sift through its layers, scholars debate its meanings, tourists wander its corridors. But the truth of Knossos, what it meant to those who built it, who lived and worshipped within its labyrinthine walls, drifts just beyond reach. Perhaps that is its enduring power. Knossos is not only a ruin of stone, but a mirror of imagination. Each generation has seen in it what it wished to see: a seat of kingship, a temple of goddess worship, a labyrinth of monsters, a prototype of Atlantis. The palace resists final interpretation, remaining always half in shadow, half in light. And so Knossos whispers still, through broken walls and painted fragments, through stories carried forward by memory and myth. It invites us deeper into its labyrinth, promising discovery, but never full revelation. What waits at its center, truth, legend, or something between, remains hidden as we take our first steps into the story of the Minoans. Chapter 2. Phaistos, the mysterious disk south of Crete's mountainous spine, where the fertile Messara plain stretches toward the Libyan Sea, lies the palace of Phaistos. Unlike the sprawling grandeur of Knossos, Phaistos feels quieter, more measured, as though designed for intimacy rather than spectacle. Its broad staircases descend with deliberate rhythm, guiding visitors down into open courtyards, where ceremonies may once have unfolded beneath the open sky. Excavations here revealed storerooms, workshops, and halls, echoing the same palatial tradition found across Crete, but with its own subtle character. It was in this palace, in the summer of 1908, that Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier uncovered one of the most haunting enigmas of archaeology, the Phaistos Disc. Lying in the northern section of the palace, in what may have been a basement shrine or archive room, the disc was discovered amidst a scattering of tablets and clay fragments. Roughly 15 centimeters in diameter, pressed with a spiral of symbols on both sides, it is a unique artifact. No other example has ever been found. The disc itself is made of fired clay, impressed with carefully stamped signs that spiral inward like a coiled riddle. The images are simple, yet strangely evocative. Plumed helmets, fish, flowers, shields, tools, animals, and abstract shapes. Some resemble pictographs, others appear almost syllabic, but together they form a sequence that scholars cannot yet decode. Unlike Linear A or Linear B, which were written with styluses, the disc's symbols were pressed with stamps, the earliest known example of movable type, long before Gutenberg's press. And yet, despite the technological novelty, the message it carries has remained unread. Scholars have debated endlessly. Is it a hymn sung to a goddess, a legal decree, a calendar, a board game, or even a magical incantation? Each theory has its champions, and each crumbles under scrutiny. The disc refuses translation, as if its spiral was meant not for us, but for minds long vanished. Its uniqueness deepens the mystery. If the disc were part of a larger system of printing, where are the others? Why does no second example exist among the thousands of artifacts uncovered across Crete and the Aegean? Was it a ritual object made only once, a symbolic experiment in language, or perhaps something foreign, brought to Crete from a culture we no longer recognize? Archaeologists have sifted through layers of the palace and beyond, but no companion has ever been found. Phaistos itself adds to the atmosphere of enigma. The palace, built and rebuilt across centuries, mirrors Knossos in design yet differs in scale. Its courtyards are broad and sunlit, framed by staircases that lead not to labyrinthine confusion, but to open ceremonial space. The southern entrance staircase, with its wide stone steps descending to the great court, suggests a procession ground, a place for gathering, feasting, or ritual performance. From the terrace, one looks out across the Messara plain, fertile and green, a land that sustained generations. Yet like Knossos, Phaistos met destruction more than once. Around 1700 BCE, the first palace fell to earthquake and fire. It was rebuilt on grander lines, only to fall again in the mid-15th century BCE, amid the same wave of catastrophes that silenced palaces across Crete. In its ruins, archaeologists found not only the disc, but tablets written in Linear A, fragments of pottery, and evidence of sudden abandonment. The palace's silence mirrors the disc itself. Fragments of language, yet no clear voice. The disc has invited speculation far beyond academic circles. Some claim it encodes astronomical knowledge, tracking cycles of the sun or moon. Others see in its spirals echoes of ritual chants, designed to be spoken aloud in rhythm with the symbols. A few fringe theories suggest it is not Minoan at all, but imported from Anatolia, the Levant, or even farther east. Its isolation allows the imagination to wander, for without parallel, every possibility remains open. For over a century, the disc has resisted decipherment. Attempts at statistical analysis, computer modeling, and linguistic comparison have failed to crack its code. Unlike Linear B, which yielded to Michael Ventris's breakthrough in 1952, the disc remains mute. Its spiral holds a secret that refuses the key. Even the authenticity of its message has been questioned. Was it truly a functional text, or was it symbolic, an artifact meant only for ritual display? Without another example, we cannot know. What we do know is that the disc emerged from a world already fragile. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, Crete's palatial system was under strain. The eruption of Thera, sometime between 1628 and 1500 BCE, sent shockwaves across the Aegean. Earthquakes, ashfall, and tsunamis may have shaken the foundations of Minoan power. Into this instability came foreign influence. The Mycenaeans of the mainland, whose presence is marked in the later layers of Knossos. Phaistos, like so many others, succumbed to fire and was never rebuilt. The disc, then, is more than an artifact. It is a relic of a world on the edge of transformation, a civilization whose voice was already beginning to fade. Its spiral may record a prayer never heard again, a decree issued in a language never spoken after the flames. Or perhaps it was always singular, always enigmatic, even to those who made it. We cannot ask, for the makers are long gone, their language silent. Today, the Phaistos Disc rests in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum, displayed under glass, its symbols still spiraling inward toward an unreadable center. Visitors gaze upon it as Evans once gazed upon the throne of Knossos, as Pernier once lifted it from the earth, with wonder, with curiosity, with questions unanswered. The disc is an object that seems to resist not only translation but final understanding. Around it, the ruins of Phaistos stand under the Cretan sun, open and silent. Grand staircases lead downward into empty courts, their ceremonies long forgotten. Storerooms stand bare, once filled with goods that sustained life. Walls rise only to waist height now, their upper stories long gone, leaving only fragments to suggest what once was. And somewhere in those fragments lies the echo of a hand that pressed a spiral of symbols into wet clay, fired it, and left it behind. Why only one disc? Why these symbols and no others? Why here, in the southern palace, and not in the great archives of Knossos? These questions linger like the wind across the Messara plain. The disc does not answer. It simply waits, its spiral turning inward, drawing us closer to a center we can never quite reach. And so, the Phaistos Disc endures, as both artifact and mystery, as puzzle and silence. It is the voice of a civilization muffled, half-heard, spiraling toward meaning but never fully revealed. Perhaps that is its gift, to remind us that not all knowledge is ours to command, that some truths remain hidden in the folds of time. Chapter 3, Zakros, the Eastern Palason. The far eastern edge of Crete, where the mountains fold into the sea and the coastline bends toward the horizon, lies the palace of Zakros. Remote, isolated, and yet profoundly connected, it is the smallest of the Minoan palaces, but perhaps the most hauntingly preserved. Here, far from the bustle of Knossos and the fertile plains of Phaistos, Zakros opened a gateway, not only to the eastern Aegean, but to Egypt, Syria, Cyprus, and beyond. Its port linked Crete with the wider world, making this quiet corner a threshold between the island and the great civilizations of the Bronze Age. Excavated in the 1960s by Nikolaos Platon, Zakros offered archaeologists something rare, a palace frozen in time. Unlike Knossos, repeatedly rebuilt and altered across centuries, Zakros remained sealed beneath sudden destruction. Storerooms were found with their jars still in place, ivory inlays scattered where craftsmen once worked, and imported goods resting where they were last handled. Amphorae bore the residue of oil, wine, and grain, their contents long since vanished, but their presence speaking of abundance. Exotic items, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, faience from Egypt, and carved ivories from Syria, testified to a world of far-reaching exchange. This was no provincial outpost. Though smaller in scale, Zakros pulsed with wealth and international influence. Its architecture echoed the palatial style of Crete. Central courts, storage magazines, workshops, and a complex of rooms that blended administrative, ceremonial, and domestic life. Yet its character felt distinct, shaped by its Eastern orientation. The workshops revealed traces of fine craftsmanship, particularly in metalworking and luxury goods. This was a palace not only of governance, but of artisanship, of exchange, and of cultural blending. The storerooms of Zakros speak volumes about its role. Rows of large pithoi, or storage jars, lined its chambers, once filled with oil, wine, grain, and other staples of the Minoan economy. In some, traces of resins and perfumes lingered, suggesting trade in luxury oils and scented goods. Such goods were destined for markets far beyond Crete, carried across the sea in Minoan ships. Zakros, positioned on the island's eastern coast, was a natural port of departure. The last Minoan threshold before open waters led to Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt. What makes Zakros uncanny is the clarity of its preservation. Many of the objects found there seem to have been left in place, as if time simply stopped. Tables, tools, and ornaments lay where they had last been set. In one room, ivory carvings, delicate and unfinished, were scattered on the floor, as though craftsmen had been interrupted mid-task. In another, imported goods rested in storage, waiting for distribution. Unlike the ruins of Knossos, whose layers bear the scars of centuries of rebuilding, Zakros feels like a single moment sealed by catastrophe. That catastrophe, however, is not fully understood. Like so many Minoan sites, Zakros was destroyed around 1450 BCE in the wave of island-wide collapse that silenced nearly every palace. Archaeologists found evidence of fire in its rooms, but also hints of earthquake damage. Some suggest the eruption of Thera, with its massive tsunamis, may have reached this vulnerable coast, inundating its port and battering the palace with waves. Others argue for conquest, that Mycenaean forces, arriving from mainland Greece, brought violence and fire to Crete's eastern shore. Each theory leaves questions unanswered, and Zakros, like its sister palaces, refuses to tell the full story. The location itself feeds the mystery. Zakros lies in a natural amphitheater of hills, opening onto the sea. Its harbour would have been protected yet accessible, a safe anchorage for fleets of trading ships. From here, one can imagine vessels setting sail at dawn, their prows carved and painted, their sails catching the Cretan wind as they journeyed towards Cyprus or Ugarit. The finds within the palace confirm this maritime life. Copper ingots, imported pottery, and artifacts that travelled hundreds of miles before coming to rest in these storerooms. Zakros was, in many ways, the eastern hand of Crete, reaching outward toward the world. Walking among its ruins today, the sense of intimacy remains. The palace does not overwhelm with scale. Instead, it draws the visitor inward into courts and corridors where light and shadow still play across stone. The staircases are narrower, the courts more enclosed, the rooms better preserved than at other palaces. One can almost imagine the rhythm of life continuing here. Scribes recording shipments, priests performing rites, craftsmen shaping ivory and bronze. It is as if the voices of Zakros were hushed, not erased, leaving their echoes behind in every jar and tool. The suddenness of its destruction magnifies its silence. Unlike Knossos, which lingered on under Mycenaean influence, Zakros did not revive. Once silenced, it remained abandoned. Its ruins were covered by soil, its port reclaimed by the sea, its memory fading into the hills. Only in the 20th century did the world rediscover it, and in its chambers, archaeologists found not only wealth, but stillness, a portrait of prosperity cut short. What happened that day remains unknown. Did tremors shake the palace, toppling walls and kindling fire? Did waves crash through the harbour, sweeping ships inland and flooding storerooms? Did foreign warriors descend upon its gates, their arrival marking the end of Minoan autonomy? Each possibility lingers, but none are confirmed. Zakros keeps it secret, and yet in that silence, Zakros tells us something profound. It shows us a civilization deeply connected to its neighbours, a culture both local and international, one that thrived in its remoteness because of its openness to the wider world. It shows us artisans at work, merchants at trade, priests in ritual, and rulers presiding over wealth drawn from distant lands. It shows us a hub that was both provincial and global, both intimate and expansive. Today, the ruins lie open to the sky, their stones warmed by the Cretan sun. The storerooms stand empty, their jars long since removed to museums, but the sense of clarity remains. Zakros feels less like a ruin and more like a snapshot. A single moment preserved, a pause in the long rhythm of history. For those who walk among its stones, it offers not answers, but the uncanny sensation of time standing still. And so, Zakros remains the Eastern Palace, small yet wealthy, provincial yet connected, destroyed yet preserved. Its silence invites us to listen more closely, to imagine the ships on its horizon, the artisans in their workshops, the jars in their storerooms. It invites us to ask why such a place, so prosperous and so connected, could fall so suddenly into stillness. The sea laps quietly at the shore nearby, as it has for millennia. The hills rise around the site, sheltering it in their embrace. And within those stones, the memory of Zakros endures. A palace at the edge of Crete, a hub of trade and culture silenced in an instant. preserved in uncanny clarity and still waiting to reveal its final secret. Chapter 4. Akrotiri, the buried city of Thera across the blue expanse of the Aegean Sea north of Crete, lies the island of Thera, today called Santorini. Its crescent shape curves around a vast volcanic caldera, a reminder of one of the most cataclysmic eruptions in human history. Yet long before this landscape was torn apart by fire and ash, Thera was home to a thriving Bronze Age town, Akrotiri, hidden for over 3 millennia beneath volcanic pumice. Akrotiri emerged from obscurity only in the late 1960s, when Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos began excavations. What he uncovered was astonishing. Streets lined with multi-story houses, some 3 stories tall, complete with staircases and windows. Walls still bright with frescoes, not the fragmentary art of survival, but vivid, living colour preserved by ash. Rooms filled with pottery, storerooms stacked with jars of oil and wine, workshops with tools laid aside. Akrotiri, often called the Pompeii of the Aegean, had been frozen at the moment of catastrophe, and yet, unlike Pompeii, Akrotiri yielded no bodies. No hurried skeletons caught mid-flight, no remains buried in collapsed buildings. The absence is haunting. Did the inhabitants evacuate before the eruption? Did they sail away across the sea, perhaps to Crete, carrying their lives with them? Or were they caught in some later catastrophe, lost not beneath ash but in waters far from the island? The silence of their absence is as striking as the preservation of their homes. The frescoes of Akrotiri are among the most beautiful survivals of the Bronze Age world. On plaster walls, artists painted lilies swaying in the wind, dolphins leaping in blue seas, monkeys clambering among rocks, and flocks of swallows darting across skies of brilliant red. These images are not stiff formal portraits but lively scenes of nature, rendered with a freshness that feels almost modern. One fresco shows 2 young men carrying fish in procession, their bodies lean and lithe, their hair flowing. Another depicts a flotilla of ships sailing between towns, their prows adorned, their sails unfurled, a window into the maritime life of the Aegean. These paintings tell us something vital. Akrotiri was not an isolated outpost. It was connected to the Minoan world of Crete, sharing its art, its architecture, and its rhythms of trade. The houses, with their central courts and storerooms, echo the design of Cretan palaces. The pottery, too, reflects Minoan influence. Even the layout of the town, with its drainage systems and planned streets, speaks to a sophisticated culture, one in dialogue with Crete and the wider Aegean. Some scholars argue that Akrotiri may have been a Minoan colony, or at least deeply within the orbit of Minoan influence. The eruption that ended this flourishing town was one of the largest in recorded prehistory. Estimates suggest it took place between 1628 and 1500 BCE, though the exact date remains contested. Ice core samples and tree ring evidence hint at an earlier date, while archaeological synchronisms suggest later. Regardless, the scale of the event was staggering. The volcano exploded with a force hundreds of times greater than the eruption of Vesuvius. Entire portions of the island collapsed into the sea, creating the caldera we see today. Ash plumes rose into the stratosphere, carried across the Mediterranean, perhaps even as far as Egypt and Anatolia. The immediate effects on Thera were apocalyptic. Akrotiri was buried beneath meters of ash and pumice. The island's surface was scoured clean, its landscape reshaped. Out at sea, tsunamis surged outward, striking the coastlines of the Aegean. Crete, lying only 70 miles to the south, may have been battered by waves that swept harbours, destroyed fleets, and inundated lowland settlements. Even if the palaces of Crete did not fall immediately, their maritime lifelines were severed, their economy disrupted, their confidence shaken. The long-term effects may have reached far beyond the Aegean. Ash clouds could have altered climate patterns, dimming sunlight, reducing harvests, and unsettling societies across the eastern Mediterranean. Ancient Egyptian records speak of strange skies and failed crops in this era. Hittite texts hint at turmoil and famine. While we cannot directly tie every ripple to Thera, the eruption's scope was global in its reach. For centuries, the memory of such an event may have lingered in myth. When Plato, writing 1,000 years later, told the story of Atlantis, an island civilization flourishing, powerful, and suddenly destroyed in a single day and night, many have wondered whether he was echoing dim recollections of Thera. Akrotiri, with its wealth, its frescoes of ships, and its sudden obliteration, has often been linked to this legend. Was Plato's Atlantis in fact a cultural memory of Minoan Crete and Thera's destruction? Or is the resemblance only coincidence, a pattern our minds weave between story and ruin? The unanswered questions multiply. If the inhabitants of Akrotiri evacuated before the eruption, where did they go? Did they find refuge in Crete, swelling the population of its coastal towns? Did they attempt to return afterward, only to find their island uninhabitable? Or did they vanish into the anonymity of history, their voices merging with those of other Bronze Age peoples displaced by catastrophe? The silence of their absence resists every attempt at closure. Akrotiri's excavation continues to reveal new wonders. Only a fraction of the town has been uncovered. Much still lies buried beneath volcanic deposits. Each year brings new frescoes, new rooms, new glimpses of daily life. We see furniture preserved in negative impressions within the ash, utensils resting in kitchens, tools in workshops, even the remains of stored food. These details remind us that Akrotiri was not a mythic city, but a living one, home to fishermen, artisans, merchants, and children. A community that woke one morning to a world that would end. To stand in Akrotiri today is to step into a paradox. The rooms are empty, the people gone, yet their presence lingers in every painted wall and every vessel left in place. The silence is not one of erasure, but of suspension, as though time itself held its breath. The volcano that destroyed Akrotiri also preserved it, locking a Bronze Age town in a tomb of pumice. Through its destruction, it became eternal. Yet the questions remain unresolved. Where did its people go? How did the eruption alter the fate of Crete and the Minoans? Was this the disaster that echoes in Plato's tale of Atlantis? We cannot know with certainty. We can only walk the streets, gaze at the frescoes, and listen to the silence. In that silence, we hear both the brilliance of a lost town and the echo of a catastrophe that reshaped the Aegean. Akrotiri endures not only as an archaeological site, but as a mystery. A reminder that civilizations can vanish in a single moment, and that even in destruction, they leave whispers that reach us across millennia. Chapter 5. Mallia. The silent courtyard. On Crete's northern shore, where the island opens to the Aegean winds, lie the ruins of Mallia. Unlike Knossos, whose grand staircases and restored frescoes dominate imagination, Mallia presents itself without embellishment. Its stones lie bare beneath the sky, its walls low and unfinished, its courtyards wide and unadorned. To walk here is to sense not reconstruction, but exposure, a palace stripped to its essence, as if time had left it raw for us to enter. The palace at Mallia was first uncovered in the early 20th century by French archaeologists, who sought to map the rhythm of Crete's palatial system beyond Knossos and Phaistos. What they found was a structure large and intricate, yet carrying a strangely incomplete quality. Its walls suggest ambition, its courts suggest grandeur, yet many of its chambers feel unfinished, as though construction ceased abruptly, or was never fully realized. This ghostly incompletion lends Mallia its atmosphere, less polished than Knossos, less intimate than Zakros, but no less mysterious. At its heart lies the central courtyard, one of the most expansive on the island. Here, under the open Mediterranean sky, life unfolded. The courtyard would have hosted gatherings, rituals, perhaps athletic contests or feasts. Unlike enclosed throne rooms or hidden shrines, Mallia's focus was outward, communal, under the gaze of sun and wind. To stand here is to imagine processions moving in rhythm, dancers circling, priests pouring libations, and communities gathering in shared ritual. Yet the details, the precise meaning of these acts, remain elusive, hidden behind silence. Artifacts from Mallia remind us of the palace's wealth and artistry. In its storerooms, archaeologists uncovered massive stone basins, perhaps used for mixing wine, for oil storage, or for ritual washing. The richness of Mallia's finds suggests a society deeply invested in both daily sustenance and ceremonial life. Among the treasures discovered here, none is more celebrated than the bee pendant. Fashioned in gold, the pendant shows two bees, wings outstretched, facing each other over a drop of honey. Their bodies curve with delicate precision, their legs grasping a small sphere, their wings textured with filigree. This jewel, a masterpiece of Minoan craftsmanship, embodies fertility, renewal, and the cycles of nature. In Minoan belief, bees were more than insects. They were symbols of life's constant renewal, of the transformation from flower to fruit, of the sweet abundance that sustains communities. The bee pendant, discovered at Mallia, has become one of the enduring emblems of Minoan art, a small object that carries the immensity of symbolic meaning. The palace itself, however, also carries scars. Layers of destruction mark its history, just as they do across the island. Around 1700 BCE, the first palace at Mallia fell to earthquake or fire, only to be rebuilt. Its second incarnation thrived for centuries, linking the northern coast to trade routes that stretched across the Aegean. But like the others, it too met its end around 1450 BCE, silenced amid the wave of catastrophe that swept Crete. Its walls collapsed, its storerooms burned, and its courtyards emptied, leaving behind only the bare stone foundations we see today. To wander through Mallia is to feel the openness of its spaces. Unlike Knossos, where Arthur Evans rebuilt staircases and painted frescoes to resurrect his vision of the Minoan world, Mallia has been left in its raw state. This makes it in some ways more powerful. The silence here feels unmediated. The visitor stands amid ruins that speak only through their arrangement. The great court stretching wide, the storerooms aligned in sequence, the workshops clustered in corners. There are no reconstructions to guide imagination, only stone, sun, and silence. Mallia reminds us that the Minoan world was not a single palace, not a single myth, but a network of communities, each with its own character. Knossos dazzled with its labyrinthine grandeur. Phaistos spoke in riddles with its disc. Zakros held wealth from the eastern seas. And Mallia, with its wide court and exquisite jewelry, speaks of open gatherings, of communal ritual, of artistry tied to the cycles of fertility and renewal. And yet, despite the beauty of its finds, Mallia is shadowed by absence. The meanings of its rituals, the purpose of its basins, the voices that once filled its courts, all are gone. We see the bees in gold, but we no longer hear the chants sung beneath the sun. We walk the courtyard, but the footsteps of the dancers have vanished. What remains is only the architecture of silence, the bones of a palace whose spirit slipped away in the fires of its end. Mallia's rawness leaves room for imagination. Some visitors feel it is more authentic than Knossos, unshaped by modern hands. Others sense its incompletion as an enigma, as if the palace itself was cut short in life, never reaching full expression. Perhaps this ghostly quality is fitting, for the Minoan world, so vibrant in art and ritual, remains half understood, unfinished in our comprehension. Mallia, with its silent courtyard, embodies that condition. Open, expansive, filled with traces, yet forever incomplete. Today, the ruins lie exposed beneath the northern sky. Wind stirs across the stones, and the sun paints long shadows across the central court. The bee pendant rests in a museum, glowing with golden light, but its home remains here, among the ruins. Mallia's silence does not conceal, but invites reflection on fertility, renewal, and the fleeting nature of civilizations. And so, Mallia endures, a palace both unfinished and eternal, where a silent courtyard speaks of gatherings long past, and where a single pendant captures the cycle of life that outlasts even the fall of empires. Its voice is gone, but its presence lingers, raw and open, waiting beneath the sky. Chapter 6. Gournia. The town of everyday life. Most ruins that speak of the Minoans bear the grandeur of palaces. Vast courts, storerooms filled with wealth, staircases spiraling upward to rooms of mystery. But on the northern coast of Crete, near the Gulf of Mirabello, lies a place that whispers a different story. Gournia is not a palace, but a town. Here, among its narrow streets and modest stone houses, the Minoan world becomes tangible in ways no throne room can convey. The site was first brought to light in 1901 by Harriet Boyd, one of the pioneering women in archaeology. At a time when the field was dominated by men, Boyd's work at Gournia was groundbreaking. She uncovered not just a palace, but an entire community, a grid of streets, workshops, and homes where ordinary people lived. Her discovery was a revelation. The Minoans were not only palace builders and ritual celebrants, but also potters, smiths, farmers, and families. Walking through Gournia today feels less like stepping into a ceremonial stage and more like entering a neighborhood. The streets are narrow, winding up the hillside, lined with small rectangular houses. Each home consisted of a few rooms, with hearths for cooking, clay bins for storage, and courtyards where families gathered. The walls, made of rough stone, carry the marks of human touch, built not for spectacle, but for shelter. Here, the archaeology of daily life survives. Loom weights, spindle whirls, clay cooking pots, and small figurines of goddesses or animals that may have watched over the household. Workshops reveal another layer of life. Potters shaped vessels that stored oil and wine. Bronze smiths hammered tools and blades. Weavers worked at looms whose weights still litter the floors. The town's economy thrived on both craft and trade, its goods destined not just for local use but for exchange across the Aegean. The small acropolis above Gournia overlooked the bay where ships once anchored. From here, the community linked itself to the greater networks of Crete and beyond, to Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant. Yet despite its modest scale, Gournia was no isolated hamlet. The presence of a small palace or administrative building at its center shows that the rhythms of bureaucracy and authority touched even here. But unlike Knossos or Mallia, power at Gournia was woven into the fabric of the town rather than towering over it. Life here feels grounded, shared. A society measured not by grand frescoes but by the clatter of tools, the weaving of cloth, and the footsteps of children running down stone-paved alleys. It is this ordinariness that makes Gournia extraordinary. Archaeology often gravitates toward the monumental, the spectacular. But Gournia reminds us that civilizations are built not only in courts and temples, but also in kitchens, workshops, and fields. The loom weights tell of garments spun and woven for families. The pots speak of meals prepared and shared. The figurines whisper of prayers uttered in quiet corners of the home. In Gournia, the Minoan world reveals itself as lived experience, intimate and immediate. But, like the palaces, Gournia's story ends in destruction. Around 1450 BCE, the town was consumed by fire and abandoned. Its houses collapsed, its workshops fell silent, its streets emptied. The cause, as across Crete, may have been conquest or the aftershocks of natural disaster. Whatever the reason, the lives that once animated these rooms vanished. What remains are the outlines of walls and the scattered objects of daily use. Traces of families who cooked, worked, prayed, and dreamed. To stand in Gournia today is to feel the weight of their absence. The streets, though empty, feel ready to be walked again. The courtyards seem prepared for voices to return. Unlike the imposing ruins of Knossos, where grandeur distances us from its builders, Gournia feels close. One can imagine the texture of daily rhythms, the hum of work, the laughter of children, the quiet moments of ritual. In this way, Gournia is perhaps the most human of the Minoan sites. Its importance lies not in spectacle, but in intimacy. Gournia gives us a glimpse of the people who rarely appear in history books. Artisans, farmers, mothers, fathers, children. Those who carried the civilization forward through their daily labors. It is a reminder that behind every palace was a network of towns like this, where goods were made, ships loaded, and communities thrived. Today, the ruins of Gournia stretch across the hillside, overlooking the blue waters of the Mirabello Bay. The sun warms its stones, and the wind moves softly through its alleys. The bay, once filled with ships, lies calm and silent. Yet in the humble objects left behind, we hear echoes of the lives that once filled this town. Gournia endures as a counterpoint to the monumental. Palaces, a reminder that civilizations are not only measured by kings and myths, but by the families and communities who lived in their shadow. It is the town of everyday life, ordinary and extraordinary at once, its silence filled with memory, its stones still carrying the warmth of vanished hands. Chapter 7, the Phaistos Disc Symbols. In the storerooms of the Palace of Phaistos, on a hot July afternoon in 1908, the Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier brushed the dust from a small circular object of fired clay. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a decorated tablet, another fragment of the Minoan world so often glimpsed in shards and fragments. But as he turned it in his hands, the strangeness revealed itself. On both of its sides ran a spiral of carefully pressed symbols, arranged in perfect order, as though words were unfurling in a language never before seen. The Phaistos Disc is only 15 centimeters across, yet it holds within it one of the deepest enigmas of archaeology. 77 distinct signs were stamped into its surface, using small seals, the first known instance in history of movable type. Some symbols are vivid and familiar. A plumed helmet, a long ship, a tower-like structure, a human figure walking with arms outstretched. Others are abstract or elusive, whorls, rosettes, tools whose meaning escapes us. All are repeated in rhythmic succession, coiling toward the center of the disc in a deliberate spiral, as if leading the eye and the mind into a mystery without end. What makes the disc uncanny is its singularity. Thousands of tablets have been found across Crete inscribed in Linear A and Linear B, the two main scripts of the Minoan and Mycenaean worlds. But the Phaistos Disc stands alone. No second example has ever been found. If this was a text meant to be copied and circulated, why does only one survive? Was it an experiment abandoned before it began? Or was it a sacred object, never intended for repetition, a unique offering pressed into clay for ritual purpose? Scholars have debated the meaning of its spiral for over a century. Some have seen in it a hymn, a song to the gods, with symbols marking verses chanted aloud. Others imagine it as a list of warriors or ships, a catalogue of arms and men prepared for battle. Still others argue for foreign origins, perhaps Anatolian, perhaps Cypriot, perhaps even connected to the scripts of ancient Anatolia or the Levant. The signs resemble no known language conclusively. Each interpretation falters, falling back into speculation. The disc resists translation, as though it were designed not to communicate, but to conceal. One striking feature is its method of manufacture. The signs were not carved by hand, as with other tablets, but pressed with individual stamps. This suggests a system of movable symbols, a form of printing far earlier than the Gutenberg press of the 15th century. Yet no other such stamped text exists from the Bronze Age. The uniqueness of the disc makes it hard to place. Was it evidence of a technology lost as soon as it appeared? Or was the stamping method symbolic rather than practical, chosen for the making of a single, unrepeatable ritual object? The clay itself was fired, perhaps deliberately, perhaps accidentally, in the conflagration that destroyed the palace of Phaistos. Its survival feels almost miraculous. Had it remained unfired, it would have crumbled into dust long ago, and the world would never have known of its spiral of signs. In this sense, the disc itself is both artifact and accident, the child of destruction that became the seed of enduring fascination. Attempts at decipherment have been bold and often imaginative. Some scholars read it as a hymn to the mother goddess, the central deity of the Minoan world. Others claim it to be a board game, its spiral guiding players through symbolic stages. A few have proposed that it records an incantation, a magical formula meant to be spoken in repetition, spiraling inward as the ritual deepens. But none of these readings can be proven. Without other examples for comparison, the disc floats in isolation, its symbols like voices cut off mid-sentence, untranslatable, yet insistent. For those who hold it, the sensation is striking. The disc rests easily in the palm, light and circular, inviting touch. One imagines the hand that pressed each symbol into wet clay, the careful turning of the spiral. Was this act a routine scribal task, or was it charged with ritual gravity? Was the maker a priest, a scribe, a craftsman, or was it someone who sought to encode knowledge in a way hidden from all but the initiated? The mystery of the disc has often drawn it into larger legends. Some link it to the memory of Atlantis, an artifact of a lost civilization, holding within it the language of a people whose world was swept away. Others see in it evidence of contact with distant cultures, perhaps a cipher passed across seas, hinting at connections between Crete and lands far beyond the Aegean. The disc seems to invite projection, absorbing our questions, reflecting back only silence. In truth, its context offers few answers. It was found in a basement room, together with a Linear A tablet, a rare association of two different scripts side by side. The disc itself may date to around 1700 BCE, though the precise age is uncertain. Its symbols show repetition and structure, suggesting a language or chant, not mere decoration. But everything else remains shadowed. Its purpose, its origin, its meaning, all are withheld. Some archaeologists have wondered whether we approach the disc incorrectly. Perhaps it was not meant to be read at all, but to be seen, to be turned in the hand, to be contemplated as an object whose spiral embodied movement, eternity, the endless cycle of ritual. The spiral is one of the oldest symbols known to humankind, carved on Neolithic tombs, painted on pottery, etched into stones across Europe. To press words into a spiral was itself a gesture of symbolism. The act may have mattered as much as the content, yet we cannot resist the urge to decipher. To read is to bridge time, to hear the voices of the past. The Phaistos Disc tempts us with the possibility that the Minoans spoke to us directly, in symbols pressed 3,500 years ago, and yet it denies us comprehension. It embodies the paradox of their civilization, advanced, artistic, organized and literate, yet still voiceless in the record of history. Today, the disc rests in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum, displayed behind glass, watched by thousands of eyes each year. Its spiral continues to pull the gaze inward, a vortex of signs leading towards silence. It is perhaps the most famous artifact of Minoan Crete, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it withholds. The Phaistos Disc is not just a puzzle of language. It is a reminder of how much is lost. Civilizations rise, build, and flourish, leaving behind their art, their tools, their palaces. But their words, the very breath of their thoughts, so easily vanish. Here, in the spiral pressed into clay, we glimpse that voice, frozen and unreadable, echoing across millennia. And so, the disc remains what it has always been, a riddle within a riddle, a text that seems to speak yet refuses to be understood, a spiral that draws us inward but never to a center. It stands as a symbol of the Minoan world itself, radiant, enigmatic, silenced by time. Chapter 8. Linear A. The silent script across the palaces and towns of ancient Crete, among storerooms filled with jars of oil and amphorae of wine. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of clay tablets. On them are etched symbols, neat, rhythmic, arranged in rows. These signs, carved by scribes over 3.5 millennia ago, belong to a writing system we now call Linear A. To the Minoans, it was the script of administration, of ritual, perhaps even of law and poetry. To us, it remains an unopened door. Linear A was first recognized in the early 20th century, when Sir Arthur Evans uncovered tablets at Knossos. He noticed two related scripts, one older and more complex, which he named Linear A, and another, slightly later and simpler, which he called Linear B. For decades, both were mysterious, their signs mute. In 1952, Michael Ventris, an architect with a passion for languages, succeeded in cracking Linear B. It proved to be an early form of Greek, the language of the Mycenaeans who followed the Minoans. But when scholars tried to apply the same method to Linear A, the words refused to make sense. The script looked similar, the signs were nearly the same, yet the underlying language was not Greek. It was something else, something that has never been identified. Today, we can read the sounds of Linear A, at least in part, thanks to its overlap with Linear B, but we cannot understand the words. They belong to a vanished tongue, a language isolate with no known relatives. Some have speculated that it was the original language of Crete, spoken for centuries before the Mycenaeans arrived. Others argue that it may have been connected to Anatolia, or even to languages of the Near East. Still others imagine it as a sacred code, understood only by initiates, designed not for communication, but for secrecy. None of these theories has carried the day. Most of the Linear A tablets are administrative, recording lists of goods, allocations of resources, and inventories of harvests. Numbers are often present, tallies of grain, wine, oil, livestock. This much we can deduce from the structure of the texts and their context in storerooms and archives. But beyond these dry records, some inscriptions appear on religious vessels and ritual objects. They may contain hymns, prayers, or offerings, written for the gods of Crete. Without translation, we cannot know whether the same signs that counted amphorae of olive oil also carried the weight of sacred words. The distribution of Linear A is wide. Tablets and inscriptions have been found not only at Knossos and Phaistos, but also at Zakros, Mallia, Agia Triada, and even on islands beyond Crete. This suggests a shared literacy across the Minoan world, a system of writing used to bind together trade, ritual, and governance. Yet despite this spread, the script never seems to have been adopted outside the Aegean. Its reach was broad within, but limited without, a paradox of insularity and sophistication. What is most haunting about Linear A is not merely that it is undeciphered, but that so much of it survives. We are not dealing with a single unique artifact, as with the Phaistos Disc. Hundreds of texts remain, preserved in clay. Entire archives lay in ruins, waiting for interpretation. Civilizations often leave little behind. Here, the Minoans left us their words in abundance, and yet we cannot hear them. This silence has fed generations of speculation. Some linguists propose connections to the Luwian languages of Anatolia. Others detect echoes of Semitic roots, perhaps suggesting trade contact or colonization from the Levant. A few more adventurous voices suggest affinities to languages as far away as the Caucasus, or even links to early Indo-European dialects now extinct. But without a bilingual inscription, a Minoan Rosetta Stone, the debate remains a circle of possibilities, none decisive. The persistence of this mystery feels almost deliberate. Linear B yielded as if to say, here is Greek, here is the voice of the conquerors who followed. But Linear A holds back, as if guarding the heart of the Minoan world. Their language, their myths, their rituals remain veiled. We can reconstruct their palaces, trace their trade routes, admire their frescoes, but their words, their thoughts are locked away. And yet perhaps there are glimpses. In certain inscriptions, recurring phrases suggest formulae, repeated like refrains. These may be offerings to deities or records of tribute. Some scholars point to words that might mean wine, or honey, or offering. If so, then the tablets are not only bureaucratic, but devotional, bridging the everyday with the sacred. But such identifications remain tentative, fragile. The risk of seeing what we wish to see is always present. Linear A forces us to reflect on how fragile language is across time. It is the most direct expression of human thought, yet it can vanish utterly, leaving only symbols without meaning. The Minoans were literate, organized, and connected. They left behind hundreds of texts, and still, their voice is lost. It is a silence more profound than the collapse of their palaces, more haunting than their empty courts. To gaze upon a Linear A tablet in the Heraklion Museum is to confront that silence directly. The signs are crisp, their lines precise, their order disciplined. They suggest clarity, meaning, communication. But to the modern eye, they are as opaque as the stars. We can see that someone once wrote them with intent, with purpose, perhaps with urgency. But we cannot follow. It is possible that Linear A will never be deciphered. The language may have no relatives. Without more evidence, without that crucial bilingual text, it may remain forever mute. And perhaps that is fitting. The Minoans, remembered for their labyrinths, their mysteries and their myths, would leave us one final enigma. A script that can be read aloud, but never truly heard. And so Linear A stands, silent and unyielding, a testament to both the brilliance and the fragility of human expression. It is the script of a people whose art still dazzles, whose palaces still inspire, but whose words slip just beyond our grasp. Their language spirals away from us, like the labyrinth of Knossos itself, winding, intricate, and unresolved. Chapter 9. Linear B, the Mycenaean imprint in. The summer of 1952, in a modest London flat, a young architect named Michael Ventris unraveled a mystery that had defied scholars for decades. The clay tablets inscribed with strange wedge-like symbols, discovered first at Knossos in the early 20th century, suddenly spoke. But they did not reveal the long-lost tongue of the Minoans. Instead, Ventris demonstrated that the script known as Linear B recorded an early form of Greek, Mycenaean Greek, centuries older than Homer. This revelation shook the field of Aegean archaeology. For years, many had hoped that the tablets would unlock the words of the Minoans themselves, a glimpse into their religion, their myths, their worldview. Instead, the voices belonged to a different people. The language of Linear B pointed to mainland Greece, to the rising power of the Mycenaeans, whose fortresses crowned the hills of Mycenae, Tyrans, and Pylos. The discovery also reshaped our understanding of Crete's final centuries. For on the island, particularly at Knossos, hundreds of Linear B tablets had been found. If these tablets spoke Greek, then what did that mean for the fate of Minoan civilization? Did the Mycenaeans invade and impose their script and language upon the Cretan palaces? Or did they arrive more gradually, merging with the remnants of a weakened Minoan world? The script itself is mute on the manner of conquest, yet its presence whispers of cultural displacement. The clay tablets tell us little of myths or legends, but much about administration. They are records of rations and resources drawn up by scribes in service to a palace economy. At Knossos, the tablets speak of livestock, herds of sheep, counted and recounted, their wool destined for textile workshops. They speak of jars of oil and amphorae of wine meticulously tallied. They record offerings to gods, to Poseidon, to Thera, to Dionysus, names familiar from later Greek religion. Already present in Mycenaean times, in Pylos on the mainland, Linear B archives reveal a centralized administration overseeing vast stretches of land and people. Records list men assigned to guard the coast, suggesting fears of seaborne raids. Others track the distribution of bronze, crucial for weapon making, hinting at the machinery of war. The tablets are pragmatic, efficient and silent on matters of poetry or myth. Unlike the later Greeks, who gave us epics and tragedies, the Mycenaean scribes wrote solely to serve palace economy and bureaucracy. And yet, even in their dryness, shadows linger. The mention of gods indicates ritual activity. The lists of women, perhaps priestesses, perhaps slaves, hint at social hierarchies and religious roles. Offerings of honey, grain, and animals suggest ceremonies that took place beyond the palace walls, in sanctuaries or peak shrines. But the rituals themselves remain unseen. The myths, the songs, the prayers, if they were written, they are lost. Linear B reveals only the scaffolding of a society, not its soul. At Knossos, the survival of Linear B raises questions of timing. Sir Arthur Evans, who excavated the palace, believed the Minoans continued long after the eruption of Thera, maintaining their dominance until the Greek mainlanders eventually absorbed them. Others see in the tablets evidence that the Mycenaeans seized Knossos by force, perhaps around 1450 BCE, after a wave of destruction swept across the Cretan palaces. Linear B may then represent the script of conquerors, imposed upon a subdued island whose earlier voice, recorded in the still undeciphered Linear A, fell silent. The script itself hints at continuity and rupture. Many of its signs resemble those of Linear A, adapted to write a new tongue. This suggests the Mycenaeans inherited Minoan administrative practices, perhaps even trained by Minoan scribes, before repurposing the system for their own language. It is as though the pen was seized, and the same strokes were used to inscribe a different story. The decipherment of Linear B also exposed the limits of archaeological memory. For decades, scholars had dreamed of unlocking epic tales, perhaps Minoan myths of the bull, of the labyrinth, of the goddess who presided over mountains and seas. Instead, the words that surfaced were mundane, stripped of drama. A list of rations for chariot builders, a tally of perfumed oil, an assignment of laborers to fields. Was this dryness an inherent feature of Mycenaean writing? Or had the rich oral traditions of the Bronze Age simply never been committed to clay? Clay tablets, after all, were not designed for permanence. They were quick records, meant to be read, revised, discarded. Their survival owes only to accident, to fire. When palaces burned, the heat baked the clay hard, preserving the words for millennia. Without destruction, there would be no archive. And so what we possess are fragments, frozen moments in time, preserved by catastrophe. The tablets also remind us of erasure. The transition from Linear A to Linear B is not merely a shift in signs, but a silencing of one voice and the imposition of another. The Minoan tongue vanished from record, supplanted by Greek. Whether through conquest, assimilation, or suppression, the earlier traditions dissolved. Linear B offers confirmation of power, but it also signals loss. Even the decipherment itself carries a trace of melancholy. Michael Ventris, who unlocked the code, would die in a car accident just a few years later, in 1956, at the age of 34. His breakthrough opened the door to the Mycenaean world, but only partway. The tablets speak, but their language remains narrow, confined to the palace economy. The broader songs of the Aegean Bronze Age, the myths that may have inspired later tales of Atlantis, the labyrinth and the Minotaur, remain locked away, unwritten or destroyed. And so Linear B is both a triumph and a reminder of silence. It confirms the Mycenaean presence on Crete, marking the imprint of a new power upon old foundations. It gives us names, numbers, and gods, but withholds the inner life of its people. It gestures toward conquest, but leaves the manner and meaning uncertain. Among the ruins of Knossos and Pylos, we can picture the scribes at their work, stylus in hand, pressing symbols into wet clay, unaware that fire would one day preserve their ledgers for a distant future. They did not write for us, nor for eternity. They wrote for the palace, for the season, for the storage room, and yet, through chance and destruction, their work became the voice of an age. Still, as we read these words, we are haunted by what we do not hear. The silence of linear A beneath, the absence of narrative, of poetry, of self-reflection. A civilization's economy survives, but not its heart. The Mycenaeans left their imprint, sharp and undeniable. Yet it is the missing voices, the lost stories, the silent songs that press most heavily upon the imagination. And so we move forward, deeper into the ruins of memory, carrying with us both the words that remain and the silence that envelops them. Chapter 10. The bull-leaping frescoes on the crumbling walls of Knossos. Fragments of colour still shimmer as if alive, blues as deep as the sea, reds burning like fresh earth, whites standing out in luminous contrast. Out of these pieces, archaeologists have reassembled one of the most famous images of the Bronze Age, the bull-leaping fresco. It shows youths, both male and female, caught in a moment of impossible grace. A massive bull, horns lowered, charges forward with unstoppable power, while a human figure vaults across its back, body arched in mid-flight. Others flank the animal, poised in preparation or recovery. It is a scene of danger and elegance, frozen in paint nearly 3,500 years old. The bull appears everywhere in Minoan art and architecture, but here it comes alive with motion. Unlike static idols or carved reliefs, the frescoes breathe. Muscles ripple, limbs extend, colours pulse with rhythm. Scholars debate the meaning of this imagery. Was it a literal sport? A public performance where trained athletes leapt live bulls in arenas? Was it symbolic? A ritual act tied to fertility, renewal, or cosmic balance? Or was it mythic, a dramatization of stories now lost to us, perhaps echoed later in the legend of the Minotaur? At Knossos, the fresco fragments once adorned palace walls, a backdrop to courtyards where crowds may have gathered. The central court, broad and open, could well have served as a performance ground. Beyond Crete, depictions of bull leaping appear at Tiryns and in small ivories, suggesting the practice, or at least its imagery, spread into the Mycenaean world. The persistence of the motif hints at something more than spectacle. It carried meaning that transcended entertainment, embedding itself in the spiritual or social fabric of the Aegean. The frescoes also reveal something striking about Minoan representation. Men and women appear together, active participants in the same event. In most Bronze Age cultures, such equality of depiction is rare. Here, both genders face the same peril, vaulting across the horns of the bull. Some have seen in this a reflection of a society where women held prominent roles as priestesses or leaders of ritual. Others caution that the art may be idealized, not a mirror of lived reality. Yet still it suggests a worldview less rigidly divided than that of later Greece. The act itself, seizing the horns, springing into the air, flipping over the beast's back, demands scrutiny. Could it truly have been performed? Modern experiments suggest it might be possible, though perilous. Bulls are unpredictable, their strength and speed formidable. To attempt such a feat would be to embrace risk and skill in equal measure. If real, bull leaping may have functioned as a rite of passage, a test of courage, a way for youth to prove themselves before gods and community alike. Success would bring honor. Failure could mean injury, even death, yet not all agree it was literal. Some scholars argue the imagery was symbolic, never meant to be enacted in flesh and blood. The bull, a creature tied to fertility, the earth and the storm, may have represented forces of nature. To leap the bull could be to master chaos, to ride the surge of life itself. The human figure suspended mid-air is more than an athlete. It is humanity in delicate balance with power greater than itself. The bull's dominance in Minoan art supports this view. Its horns, stylized into sweeping crescents, crown palace walls as sacred symbols. Writer, vessels carved in the shape of bull heads, were used in libations, ritual pourings of wine, milk, or blood. Miniature figurines of bulls, carved in stone or molded in clay, were left as offerings at shrines. From the mountain sanctuaries to the courts of Knossos, the bull was ever present, an emblem of vitality, danger, and perhaps the divine. Celestial interpretations also emerge. Some researchers see in the bull echoes of the heavens, the constellation Taurus, whose rising marked the agricultural seasons, or the lunar horns mirrored in its own. The bull might thus embody cycles of time, fertility, and renewal, woven into the agricultural calendar of the Aegean. To leap the bull was to participate in cosmic rhythm, aligning human ritual with celestial motion. Still, the frescoes resist final explanation. The figures are stylized, elongated, abstracted, not naturalistic. They are not eyewitness accounts but artistic visions. Did they record real performances or imagine symbolic acts? The answer drifts between possibilities. The ambiguity is part of their power. They invite us to wonder, to envision both the dust and sweat of an arena and the mystery of a ritual dance performed for unseen gods. The frescoes also highlight the artistry of the Minoans themselves. Their mastery of color and line gives the scene fluidity, a sense of motion rarely captured in ancient art. Unlike the rigid postures of Egyptian figures or the stark forms of Mesopotamian reliefs, Minoan painting flows. Limbs curve with rhythm, torsos twist, hair streams behind. Life is not frozen, but moving, as if the walls themselves could breathe. This dynamism suggests a worldview where nature and humanity were entwined, where vitality itself was sacred. In the broader mythology of Greece, bulls reappear with insistent force. Zeus, in the form of a bull, abducts Europa from the shores of Phoenicia, carrying her across the sea to Crete. The Minotaur, half man, half bull, is imprisoned in the labyrinth by King Minos. Heracles wrestles the Cretan bull as one of his labors. These myths, recorded centuries later, echo with faint memory of an older tradition. Perhaps the bull-leaping frescoes are part of that tradition. Images of a ritual so central it survived in distorted form, transformed into myth after the practices themselves had faded. Yet for all their vibrancy, the frescoes end in silence. The walls of Knossos are broken, their colors fading, their meanings unspoken. The bulls charge eternally across plaster, but their context is lost. Were they dangerous games? Sacred rites? Cosmic dramas? Each interpretation lingers as possibility, never certainty. And so, standing before these images, one is struck not only by their beauty, but by their mystery. They are at once familiar and alien, athletes in motion, yet part of a symbolic language we no longer understand. They remind us that art, like writing, can carry meaning beyond translation. The Minoans spoke through color, form, and gesture, yet their words reach us only in fragments. What remains is vitality, captured in paint. The eternal leap, the frozen charge, the moment of suspension between life and death, order and chaos. The frescoes hold us in that breathless instant, where humanity and bull meet in perilous grace. And like so much of the Minoan world, they leave us with questions, not answers. A vision both luminous and unreachable, a fragment of a vanished rhythm still echoing faintly across the ruins. Chapter 11. The Snake Goddess. Figurines beneath the dust of Knossos. Amidst storerooms of pottery and shattered walls, Arthur Evans uncovered two figures that would come to define the Minoan world in the modern imagination. They are small, fragile, fashioned of faience, a glazed ceramic of brilliant luster. Yet despite their size, they radiate an almost unsettling power. The snake goddess figurines, bare-breasted, arms outstretched, serpents winding around their limbs, stand before us as emissaries of a lost faith. Their discovery in 1903 stirred immediate fascination. Evans believed he had found tangible proof of a great Minoan goddess, a mistress of fertility and renewal, one who bound together the natural world and the human community. The serpents, coiling and eternal, seemed to speak of chthonic power, the mysteries of the underworld, the hidden vitality of the earth. In their gaze, fixed and piercing, one senses both intimacy and divinity. Were these household idols, held close by families in prayer, or were they sacred icons used in palace ritual, embodiments of a deity once worshipped beneath the Cretan sun? The figures themselves are striking in form. Their waists are narrow, encircled by the flounced skirts typical of Minoan dress. Their breasts are exposed, an image not of eroticism, but of fertility, nourishment, and the primal forces of life. In one hand, a goddess raises serpents like extensions of her will. In another version, a feline perches atop her head, perhaps a symbol of wildness and sovereignty. The fusion of woman and animal hints at a cosmology where boundaries between human, beast, and divine were porous, a world in which sacred power coursed through all forms of life. Snakes have long carried double meaning across ancient cultures. They are feared for their venom, yet revered for their power to shed skin, symbolizing renewal and regeneration. In the Near East, serpent deities guarded thresholds and tombs, mediating between worlds. In later Greek myth, chthonic powers, from Hades to the Furies, are entwined with serpentine imagery. Within the Minoan context, the serpent may have represented the very earth itself, its unseen vitality rising through soil, crops, and the cycles of fertility. To hold the serpent was to hold command over life's renewal. Yet questions remain. Were these figures true goddesses, worshipped by the people of Crete? Or were they depictions of priestesses engaged in ritual, momentarily embodying divine power? Some scholars suggest they were votive offerings, left in shrines as petitions for fertility, harvest, or protection. Others argue they reflect household religion, domestic cults centered on the cycles of family and field. The ambiguity lingers, unresolved. Arthur Evans, steeped in Victorian imagination, saw in them echoes of a great mother goddess, comparable to the Earth Mother of Anatolia or the fertility deities of Mesopotamia. To him, Minoan religion was matriarchal, centered upon the worship of a female divinity, later overshadowed by the patriarchal gods of the Mycenaeans and Greeks. This interpretation, though evocative, has since been debated. Some archaeologists caution that we must not impose modern or mythic ideals upon fragile artifacts. What we see as goddesses may simply have been cult statues of unknown significance, their meaning long faded into silence. Still, the prominence of female imagery in Minoan art is undeniable. Women appear frequently in frescoes, richly dressed, participating in processions and ceremonies. They are not confined to the margins, but depicted at the heart of ritual. Combined with the snake goddess figurines, this suggests a society where women may have played visible, even central roles in religion and public life. If true, the figurines embody not only spiritual symbolism, but a reflection of social reality, a culture in which the feminine carried sacred authority. The craftsmanship of the figurines themselves reveals another layer of meaning. Faience, with its glassy surface and luminous finish, was a rare and imported material, likely from Egypt. Its presence in Crete signals both trade and intention. These were not crude idols shaped for everyday use, but carefully fashioned objects of high value. They may have been placed in sacred spaces within the palace, glimmering in firelight, their glazed surfaces catching the glow as rituals unfolded. The feline figure crowning one of the statues is particularly enigmatic. It may represent a lioness, an animal associated with strength and ferocity. In the Near East, lions were emblems of goddesses like Ishtar, symbols of untamed power bound to the divine feminine. Its presence atop the Minoan figure suggests parallels, or perhaps shared cosmologies across the Bronze Age world. If the snake signified the underworld and fertility, the lioness may have embodied the upper, visible power of sovereignty, together uniting earth and sky in the figure of the goddess. Yet just as quickly as these interpretations rise, they falter before the silence of time. We cannot read their prayers. We cannot hear their chants. The linear A tablets, undeciphered, remain mute, and the figurines, though eloquent in form, speak only in symbol. Were they part of seasonal rites tied to planting and harvest? Were they invoked for childbirth and protection of families? Or were they divine beings themselves, central figures in a now-vanished pantheon? The snake goddess figurines are also reminders of the precariousness of interpretation. Much of our image of Minoan religion is filtered through the reconstructions and theories of Evans, who himself may have projected his own ideals upon the past. He saw in them echoes of a peaceful matriarchal society, a utopia of harmony under the guidance of a great goddess. Yet the archaeological record is more complex. It holds signs of hierarchy, of conflict, of sudden destructions by fire and earthquake. The figurines, radiant though they are, may conceal as much as they reveal. What is certain is the aura they still cast. To stand before them today, in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum, is to feel the weight of their presence. Small though they are, no taller than a forearm, they command the gaze. Their eyes seem to fix upon us across millennia. Their serpents alive in their hands, they radiate both intimacy and distance, as if they once belonged to a world of household devotion, yet also to a sphere beyond human reach. And so, they remain both personal and cosmic. They may have stood in small shrines, carried by worshippers, placed upon altars within homes, yet they also embody forces larger than life: fertility, renewal, sovereignty, the chthonic powers of Earth itself. They balance between the ordinary and the divine, between daily life and eternal myth. The snake goddess figurines endure as emblems of mystery, They remind us that civilizations can leave behind objects of staggering beauty, yet still keep their secrets. They speak in symbols, not in words, and their meaning slips just beyond our grasp. Were they goddesses or priestesses? Sacred icons or household charms? Perhaps all of these, perhaps none. What we know is that they once mattered deeply to the people who held them, who fashioned them, who placed them in the sanctuaries of Knossos. They embodied power, renewal, and connection to the unseen. Today, they stand in silence, luminous fragments of a vanished faith, leaving us only with questions and the quiet awareness that the earth itself still keeps much of its memory hidden. Chapter 12. The Thera eruption and tsunami debate. The island of Thera, now called Santorini, rises in a broken circle of cliffs above the Aegean Sea. At its center lies a caldera filled with deep blue water, a reminder of one of the most violent natural events in human history. Long before its modern beauty drew travelers from across the world, this place was shattered by a colossal eruption, a disaster so great that it reshaped the landscape, altered the climate, and perhaps changed the course of civilizations. The eruption of Thera is more than geology. It is one of history's enigmas, standing at the crossroads of archaeology, myth, and science. Scholars agree that the event ranks among the largest volcanic eruptions ever recorded, yet they do not agree on when it occurred or what its consequences truly were. Some place it in 1628 BCE, its signature etched into tree rings and ice cores. Others argue for a date a century later, closer to 1500 BCE, aligning with the destruction layers on Crete. Between these dates lies the uncertainty that fuels endless debate. Did this eruption directly topple the Minoans, or did it merely weaken them, leaving space for Mycenaean conquest? The power of the eruption itself is unquestioned. Estimates suggest that the blast released energy equivalent to hundreds of atomic bombs. Ash rained down across the Aegean, darkening skies, suffocating crops, and choking settlements. On Thera, the thriving town of Akrotiri was entombed, its streets and frescoed houses sealed beneath layers of pumice. The sea surged violently, triggered by collapsing caldera walls. Tsunamis swept outward, striking the northern coast of Crete. In the harbors of Knossos and Palakastro, archaeologists have identified deposits of marine sand, broken pottery, and debris consistent with waves that reached far inland. For decades, many believed that this cataclysm spelled the end of Minoan supremacy. It was an explanation that seemed to fit neatly, a natural disaster of unprecedented scale, wiping out a civilization. The ash and tsunami would have devastated agriculture, crippled trade, and shattered coastal settlements. With their fleets destroyed and their fields failing, the Minoans might have struggled to maintain their power. In this narrative, the eruption becomes the single decisive blow, yet the evidence is less clear. On Crete itself, the ash layers are thinner than once thought, suggesting fallout but not absolute destruction. Palaces like Knossos continued to function after the eruption, their administrative systems still active. Linear A inscriptions persisted and art continued to flourish. The destruction levels across Crete are uneven, occurring at different times and places, not in a single synchronized collapse. This has led many scholars to conclude that the Thera eruption, though catastrophic, did not end Minoan civilization outright. Instead, it may have destabilized it, a blow from which recovery was possible, but incomplete. The dating only deepens the puzzle. Radiocarbon analysis from tree rings and ice cores points firmly to the late 17th century BCE, around 1628 BCE. But the archaeological layers on Crete suggest destruction in the mid-16th century or later, nearly a century afterward. If the eruption happened earlier, why is there such a gap between the geological event and the archaeological record of Minoan decline? Did the Minoans endure for generations after the blast, only to succumb later to Mycenaean expansion? Or is there a flaw in the dating methods themselves, an unresolved tension between science and excavation? Beyond dates and layers lies the question of causality. Did the eruption weaken Minoan trade by destroying the vital ports of the Cyclades, cutting off routes to the Greek mainland, Anatolia, and Egypt? Did famine follow from ash-choked fields, forcing dependence on dwindling reserves? Or was the greater consequence psychological? The trauma of watching the horizon darken with ash, the seas surge, and the gods themselves seemingly turn hostile. A civilization so bound to ritual, fertility, and cycles of renewal may have seen in the eruption not just disaster, but divine judgment. And yet, the Minoans endured. At Knossos, life continued with a strange resilience. Palatial frescoes painted after the eruption still show scenes of ritual, nature, and myth. The bull leaping continued. Workshops produced pottery of exquisite design. Far from annihilation, the Minoans adapted, though perhaps with diminished strength. Their dominance of the Aegean gave way to a period of uncertainty, opening the door to the encroaching power of the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. It is here that another theory emerges, that the eruption did not destroy the Minoans, but weakened them just enough for conquest. Around 1450 BCE, most of Crete's palaces were violently destroyed, their ruins bearing scars of fire and collapse. Only Knossos survived, repurposed under Mycenaean administration. Linear B, the script of the Mycenaean Greeks, began to appear, replacing the undeciphered Linear A. The voice of Crete shifted, as though the island had been conquered, its independence finally extinguished. Was the eruption of Thera the first blow, and Mycenaean conquest the final one? The debate continues, with no resolution in sight. Some geologists insist that the eruption was so vast it must have devastated Crete beyond recovery. Others argue that the archaeological continuity proves otherwise, that human resilience outweighed natural disaster. Perhaps the truth lies in the middle. The eruption did not end the Minoans, but it set in motion a chain of vulnerability, environmental, economic, psychological, that left them open to forces from beyond their shores. In this way, the Thera eruption embodies the fragility of civilizations. A single event can ripple outward, reshaping destinies in ways that are not always immediate or visible. The ash buried Akrotiri, but it also preserved its walls, giving us a glimpse of life before the disaster. The tsunamis wrecked harbors, but their deposits leave us evidence of the waves themselves. In destruction, fragments of survival remain, and so Thera stands both as a geological fact and as a historical enigma. We know it erupted, with violence beyond comprehension. We know it sent waves crashing against Crete and ash drifting across continents. But whether it ended an empire or merely altered its trajectory remains unknown. The island itself, with its caldera like a wound in the sea, holds the memory of fire and ash. Its silence is both haunting and eloquent, reminding us that the earth beneath us can rise in fury, and that even the mightiest civilizations rest on fragile ground. The Minoans looked to the sea as their highway, their protector, their wealth. But from the sea also came waves of ruin. Did they see in that moment the end of their world? Or did they, like all people facing catastrophe, rebuild, adapt, and press forward, not knowing that their time of supremacy was already passing into memory? The answers remain beyond reach, locked in the depths of the caldera, in the unquiet silence of Thera. Chapter 13. Knossos, the forgotten harbour. On the southern coast of Crete, where the Libyan Sea stretches outward toward Africa and the Levant, lies a site once drowned in silence. Today it is little more than a field of low stone foundations, half sunken in sand and thistle, winds sweeping relentlessly from the sea. Yet in the Bronze Age, Knossos was alive with sound and motion, sails unfurling, ropes creaking, amphorae thudding onto packed earth, voices in a dozen tongues echoing across the harbour. Knossos was not a palace nor a town of kings. It was a harbour, a threshold between Crete and the wider world, and in that role, it was central to the story of Minoan seafaring power. Excavations at Knossos began in the 1970s under Joseph and Maria Shaw, and what they revealed was startling. Beneath the dunes lay immense stone structures, some of the largest known on the island outside of Knossos itself. There were storage magazines lined with pithoi, massive clay jars that once held oil, grain, or wine. There were long, narrow halls that may have served as ship sheds, shelters where vessels were drawn ashore for repair. Imported pottery abounded, not only from nearby Aegean islands, but from Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant. Each shard whispered of exchange, of a world linked by maritime routes, of Crete as a middleman in the vast Bronze Age network of trade. Knossos stood at a strategic point. From its shore, one could sail directly south across the Libyan Sea, reaching the Nile Delta in a matter of days with favourable winds. Eastward lay Cyprus, rich in copper. Further still, the Levantine coast offered cedar, ivory, and luxury goods. The harbour's orientation suggests it was more than local. It was international, a gateway where Minoan Crete extended its reach far beyond the Aegean. The palaces inland, such as Phaistos, would have depended on Knossos to channel goods, tribute, and ideas across the sea. The architecture reinforces this picture of scale and ambition. The so-called Building T, stretching nearly 50 meters in length, was built with heavy stone walls and broad rooms that seem oversized for any domestic use. Its function remains debated: temple, storehouse, or administrative center. But its monumental presence at a harbor suggests that Knossos was not merely a fishing village. It was an organized node of commerce and control, tied directly to palatial administration. Amid these storerooms and halls, archaeologists also uncovered traces of ritual. Altars, figurines, and evidence of sacrifice point to cult activity at the harbor itself. This mingling of trade and religion is not surprising. For the Minoans, seafaring was not just practical but sacred. To launch a ship across uncertain waters was to place oneself in the hands of gods. The harbor may have served both as an economic hub and as a sanctuary where sailors offered prayers before departure or thanks upon return. Yet, like so many Minoan sites, Knossos met with fire and abandonment. In the late Bronze Age, its structures were burned, its walls collapsed, its storerooms left empty. Whether this destruction came at the hands of invaders or from internal collapse remains unclear. The sea that once brought wealth and connection may also have brought danger. Knossos never regained its prominence. Wind and sand slowly covered its ruins, erasing memory of the harbor's existence. For centuries it lay forgotten, a silence where once sails had crowded the horizon, and still, traces remain. Amphorae stamped with foreign marks testify to connections with distant lands. A scarab from Egypt, fragments of Cypriot pottery, and Mycenaean wares hint at Knossos' role as a crossroads of cultures. Even after the fall of the Minoan palatial system, the harbour seems to have been used intermittently, repurposed by those who followed. Layers of reuse complicate the picture, blurring the line between Minoan and Mycenaean, between collapse and continuity. Knossos is important not only for what it reveals, but for what it represents. The Minoans were not an isolated island culture. They were sailors, traders, and negotiators across a vast maritime network. Their ships carried oil, wine, and textiles outward and brought back copper, tin, ivory, and luxury goods. They absorbed influences and disseminated them in return. Knossos was one of the points where this great circulation touched the ground, where the abstract web of trade became tangible in stone warehouses and clay jars. And yet, standing among its remains today, the silence is overwhelming. The wind carries only the hiss of the sea, the crash of waves on the shore. The harbour is gone, its ships vanished, its magazines empty. The scale of what was once here can only be imagined, reconstructed from fragments of pottery and outlines of walls. Like so much of the Minoan world, Knossos is both presence and absence, a reminder of a society that was expansive, outward-looking, and yet vulnerable to the forces of time and history. The forgotten harbour thus joins the chorus of ruins across Crete. Each site adds a note: palaces, towns, sanctuaries, ports. Together, they once formed a network of life and power. Today, each lies in silence, leaving us to piece together their story. Knossos, once alive with trade and ceremony, now offers only its windswept stones. It is another fragment in the broken mosaic of the Minoan world, a fragment that hints at how much was lost and how much remains beyond reach. Chapter 14. The Horns of Consecration. Across the ruined palaces of Crete, scattered among fallen stones and weathered thresholds, there rise forms at once simple and enigmatic. Twin projections carved from stone, curving upward like the tips of a bull's horns. They stand on parapets, on stairways, on the roofs of shrines and temples. Archaeologists call them the Horns of Consecration. The name was coined by Sir Arthur Evans, who saw in these shapes a sacred emblem, a symbol of dedication, consecration, and power. To him, their meaning was inseparable from the bull, that ever-present creature in Minoan imagery. Bulls appear in frescoes, writa, seal stones, and in the great leaping games where human bodies twisted over their charging forms. The horns, abstracted into stone, seem to Evans an unmistakable sign of religious devotion. Yet beyond his interpretation lies only silence. No inscription explains them. No surviving tradition illuminates their role. They appear everywhere. At Knossos, a monumental set of horns was placed prominently upon the palace, visible to those who approached from below. At Mallia, smaller versions punctuate the edges of courtyards. At sacred caves and peak sanctuaries high in the Cretan mountains, horns of consecration have been found among offerings and figurines. Even on tiny seal stones and clay models, the motif repeats. Twin arcs rising into the air, sometimes framing a sacred tree, sometimes set beside altars. The sheer repetition suggests a shared island-wide cultic vocabulary. These were not isolated decorations. They were a language in stone, repeated again and again until its meaning was ingrained in the fabric of Minoan life. But what precisely did they mean? Some scholars see them as markers of sacred space, boundary stones declaring, "Beyond this point lies the realm of the divine." Others suggest they were protective emblems, harnessing the raw power of the bull as a guardian over palace and shrine. Still others wonder if the horns were more abstract, not literal bull horns at all, but stylized mountains, or even a hieroglyphic symbol lifted from the Minoan script and made monumental. The bull connection remains persuasive. Bulls were not mere animals in Minoan Crete. They were embodiments of force, fertility, and celestial rhythm. The animal's association with thunder, with storm, with virility and sacrifice echoes across Mediterranean myth. In later Greek tradition, Zeus himself takes the form of a bull, abducting Europa across the sea to Crete. The Minotaur, too, fuses human and bull into a single mythic being, confined within the labyrinth at Knossos. It is tempting to see in the horns of consecration the earliest expression of this enduring symbolism. The bull not just as beast, but as bridge between man and God. Yet the austerity of the horns contrasts sharply with the color and fluidity of Minoan art. The frescoes burst with movement, dolphins leaping, lilies unfurling, dancers turning in ritual grace. The horns, by comparison, are stark and immovable, twin curves of stone, stripped of embellishment, silent against the sky. This contrast may have been deliberate. Where fresco and pottery captured the living vibrancy of nature, the horns offered permanence, solidity, a fixed marker of the sacred that endured long after ceremonies had ended. Excavations revealed that the horns varied in size and material. Some were carved from limestone or gypsum, rising as high as a man. Others were fashioned from terracotta or clay, small enough to fit upon household shrines. This scaling suggests they were not only public symbols, but also private ones. The same emblem that crowned a palace may also have adorned a common household, binding elite and ordinary life within a shared framework of belief. Still, no text names them. Linear A, still undeciphered, remains mute on their function. Linear B, written later by Mycenaean hands, records rations and inventories, but nothing of meaning or myth. Thus, the horns of consecration remain suspended between certainty and speculation, like so much of Minoan religion. Were they emblems of a singular deity, perhaps a bull god or a mountain mother? Or were they polyvalent, adaptable symbols, carrying layered meanings that shifted depending on context? Boundary marker, protective sign, sacred icon, all at once. The mystery deepens when we consider their persistence. Even after the palaces fell, and after Mycenaean influence swept across the island, the horns continued to appear. They were not easily discarded, as if their form had taken root in the consciousness of the people. Perhaps, like the cross in later ages, they had become a symbol so saturated with meaning that it could endure through cultural shifts, its significance too deep to erase. Today, the horns of consecration rise mute and weathered against the Cretan sun. Their edges crumble, their surfaces are rough with age, but their form is unmistakable. Visitors walking through Knossos still see them, poised above the reconstructed walls, casting shadows across the stone. They stand not only as remnants of Minoan religion, but as emblems of the unknowable, reminders that symbolism was central to this society, yet remains half hidden from our understanding. In their simplicity lies their power. Two arcs of stone lifted skyward, simultaneously minimal and profound. They speak to a world where boundaries between human, animal, and divine were porous. A world where symbols held lives together, binding ritual, architecture, and daily practice into a seamless whole. The horns of consecration endure, but their meaning hovers just beyond reach. Another fragment of a vanished language, another silence carved into stone. And so they remain, patient upon the ruins, watching as they once watched processions and ceremonies long vanished. Guardians of a faith without words, they stand as thresholds between what we know and what we cannot yet recover. Their mute presence leads us onward, deeper into the labyrinth of the Minoan world, where each stone carries a symbol, and each symbol conceals a secret. Chapter 15, Aya Triada, sarcophagus amid the olive groves of southern Crete, not far from the shadow of Phaistos, lies the small settlement of Akrotiri. It was here, in 1903, that Italian archaeologists uncovered one of the most remarkable finds of the Bronze Age, a painted limestone coffin, sealed in the soil for more than 3,000 years. Known as the Akrotiri sarcophagus, it stands as the only limestone coffin of its kind from Minoan Crete, and one of the most vivid windows into the rituals of a vanished civilization. Unlike the terracotta larnaces more commonly used for Minoan burials, this sarcophagus was monumental, carved from stone and carefully plastered. Its surfaces were covered with fresco-like paintings, scenes that stretch across both long sides and even onto the ends. Figures advance in procession. Animals are led towards sacrifice. Priests and priestesses pour libations into tall stands accompanied by music, while sacred symbols punctuate the imagery: horns, double axes, and altars. The coffin is not only a vessel for the dead, it is a canvas of belief, a rare glimpse of ritual frozen in pigment. The sarcophagus dates to around 1400 BCE, a liminal time when Crete was passing under the shadow of Mycenaean power. Yet the imagery retains a distinctly Minoan character. Women, richly dressed, take central roles, pouring offerings and leading rites. Musicians play the orlos, the double flute, their sound suggested in painted rhythm. Animals are tethered, awaiting sacrifice. All unfolds within a ceremonial landscape, punctuated by altars and sacred objects, where the living and the dead seem to meet. The first long side shows a procession of figures bringing offerings. At the center stands a high stand or altar, into which a woman pours a libation, her gesture calm, deliberate. Another figure approaches with a tray of offerings. To one side, a bull is bound for sacrifice, the knife poised. Beyond him, musicians perform, their instruments held with precision. It is a scene of order and ritual choreography, where every gesture conveys meaning. The opposite long side presents a more enigmatic tableau. Here, a chariot drawn by two mythical griffins carries a male figure, possibly the deceased or perhaps a divinity. Women again approach with offerings, while birds, sacred creatures of the air, hover above. The composition suggests movement between realms, as if the coffin depicts not only ritual in the world of the living, but also the journey of the soul into the beyond. At the short ends, more scenes unfold. One shows a pair of chariots, possibly funerary processions. Another depicts a shrine, flanked by double axes, the labyrinth that appears so often in Minoan iconography. Everywhere, the images are saturated with religious undertones: libation, sacrifice, offering, the sacred presence of animals and symbols. But what do these scenes truly mean? Scholars have debated their interpretation for over a century. Some see in the sarcophagus an actual depiction of funerary ritual, showing how the Minoans honored the dead with offerings of blood, wine, and music. Others believe the imagery transcends the individual burial, presenting a mythic or seasonal rite tied to fertility and renewal. Still others point to the blending of styles, Minoan themes rendered in a medium and composition that feels distinctly Mycenaean, as evidence of cultural fusion at a time of transition. The rarity of the object adds to the mystery. No other painted limestone sarcophagus has been found from Minoan Crete. Why was this coffin made, and for whom? Was it crafted for a local ruler, a priestly figure, or a person of unusual significance? Its uniqueness suggests it may have been commissioned under special circumstances, a singular vessel meant to capture rites otherwise lost to time. The sarcophagus also raises questions about the role of the dead in Minoan belief. Were ancestors venerated through ongoing rituals, their spirits fed with offerings? Were the painted scenes not only representations, but instructions, guiding the soul and reminding the living of their duty to maintain bonds across generations? The presence of sacrifice, libation, and procession suggests that death was not an end but a passage, marked by ceremonies that bound community, cosmos, and the departed into a single act. In the figures themselves, we see traces of identity, though never fully revealed. Women appear prominently, not as passive mourners, but as active officiants. They pour, they lead, they carry offerings. If these are priestesses, they suggest a society where women held spiritual authority, a notion consistent with other Minoan artifacts, the snake goddess figurines, the frescoes of women in ritual dress. If they are goddesses incarnate, then the coffin may depict divine rites rather than human ceremonies. Either way, the prominence of female figures stands out, setting Minoan imagery apart from many contemporaneous cultures. The bull, too, returns with symbolic weight. Bound for sacrifice, its presence links the sarcophagus to the wider imagery of Minoan ritual, where bulls were central to both play and worship. Was its blood intended to nourish the dead, to consecrate the passage into the afterlife, or to echo agricultural cycles of life and death? No inscription tells us. The meaning rests in the gesture of the knife and the tethered animal, poised at the threshold of offering. Even the pigments whisper of meaning. Though faded, traces of red, blue, and black suggest a palette once vibrant. The figures were not pale abstractions, but clothed in colour, their garments patterned, their offerings bright. To the mourners of Aia Triada, the sarcophagus would have been alive with hues, a moving pageant rendered permanent upon stone. Time has dimmed those colours, yet even in decay they radiate solemnity. The blending of Minoan and Mycenaean elements complicates interpretation further. The Minoans favoured lively, naturalistic art, while the Mycenaeans inclined toward rigid formality. The sarcophagus seems to merge these tendencies. The rituals are Minoan, steeped in libation and procession, but the compositional framing, the use of registers, the placement of figures in strict bands, feels Mycenaean. Was this coffin the product of a Mycenaean artist working in Crete, or a Cretan workshop adapting to new influences? The hybrid form mirrors the island itself, poised between autonomy and subjugation, between memory of its own traditions and the weight of foreign rule. For archaeologists, the Aia Triada sarcophagus remains a keystone artifact. It is one of the few objects that seems to open a direct window into Minoan ritual practice, even if the view is clouded. Its scenes echo with gestures that feel at once familiar and elusive. Processions, offerings, sacrifice, all resonate with later Greek rituals and with religious practices across the Mediterranean world. Yet their exact context remains veiled, a liturgy preserved in image but not in word. Standing before the sarcophagus today, in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum, one feels the silence of time pressing close. The figures advance eternally, frozen in mid-step. The libation pours endlessly, never completed. The bull waits forever at the altar. It is a pageant without sound, a ritual without conclusion, a ceremony repeating across 3.5 millennia. What the people of Aia Triada believed, we may never know. Did they imagine the soul rising on griffin-drawn chariots, borne toward divine realms? Did they hope to sustain the dead through ongoing rites, feeding them with wine, music, and blood? Or did they see death as a moment woven into the agricultural cycle, renewal through sacrifice, the community bound together in memory? The sarcophagus does not answer. It preserves only the gestures, the colours, the outlines of belief. And so the Aia Triada sarcophagus endures, a singular relic, at once intimate and monumental. It speaks of ritual, of transition, of the mingling of cultures, yet its meaning drifts just beyond our reach, like music carried faintly on the wind, audible but not deciphered. In its painted silence, we glimpse the soul of Minoan Crete, not in words, but in procession, offering and sacrifice, forever frozen upon stone. Chapter 16. Peak Sanctuaries of Crete High, above the valleys and plains of Crete. Where the mountain air thins and the horizon stretches endlessly toward the sea, the Minoans built their sanctuaries. These were not monumental temples of stone, nor bustling palaces filled with frescoes and storerooms. They were humble shrines perched upon ridges and summits, exposed to wind and sky. And yet, in their simplicity, they hold one of the deepest keys to Minoan belief. Archaeologists call them Peak Sanctuaries. Scattered across the island, from Mount Juktas near Knossos to the rugged heights of Petsopus in the east, they stand as markers of a faith that turned upward, to the sky and outward, to the wide embrace of the land. The pilgrim who climbed these slopes 3,500 years ago would not have entered a grand enclosure. Instead, they might have gathered around an open-air altar, a low wall of stones, or a simple terrace cut into the earth. The sanctuaries were built to meet the gods in the open, beneath the same stars and shifting clouds that watched over fields, flocks, and seas. The sanctuary on Mount Juktas is among the most evocative. Rising nearly 800 meters above the Cretan plain, it looks directly down upon Knossos, the great seat of Minoan power. From here, the palace appears small, almost fragile against the sweep of land and sky. Excavations have revealed altars, offering tables, and thousands of clay figurines. Miniature men and women, animals, even tiny models of limbs. Each one is a prayer given form, A shepherd may have carried up a clay sheep, asking for the health of his flock. A mother may have brought a model of a child's leg, seeking healing or protection. The sanctuary became a mirror of daily life, condensed into symbols and left in the hands of the gods. At Phaistos, overlooking the fertile plains of eastern Crete, similar offerings have been found. Terracotta animals abound, goats, cattle, and birds. There are miniature double axes, votive altars, and countless human figures, arms raised in gestures of supplication. To climb this hill, overlooking the harbour of Palacastro and the sea beyond, was to step into a liminal space between earth and sky. The worshipper's gaze swept from cultivated land to open waters, from village to horizon. It is as if the sanctuaries were chosen not merely for altitude, but for their ability to command the whole landscape, binding worship to place. Some scholars have seen in these sanctuaries echoes of fertility cults, a religion rooted in the cycles of growth and decay. The figurines of animals suggest prayers for abundance, while the models of limbs may signal petitions for healing. Yet others believe the sanctuaries carried political weight. From these summits, the palaces could project their authority across valleys and villages, their rituals sanctifying not only land, but rule. On Mount Juctus, the peak itself resembles the face of a reclining figure, a natural feature that some have linked to the image of a sleeping god or ancestral king. In this way, the mountain itself became divine, its shape a permanent presence overseeing both worship and governance. The climb to such shrines must have been a ritual in itself. There were no roads, only rough paths worn by the feet of countless generations. Pilgrims carried offerings on their backs, ascending through thorn and stone, until the air grew thin and the plain stretched endlessly below. The act of climbing was a devotion, a physical effort to bridge the distance between the human and the divine. Once at the summit, with winds tugging at garments and clouds drifting close, the sense of boundary would blur. Heaven and earth seemed to meet upon the peak. These sanctuaries were not unique to Crete. In the wider Aegean, mountaintop shrines appear in later Greek traditions. Zeus was worshipped on lofty Ida and Olympus. Hermes was honored at cairns along high passes. The impulse to climb skyward in search of divinity is a thread that runs deep in human ritual. Yet in the Minoan sanctuaries, we glimpse an earlier stage, before the pantheon of classical Greece was fully formed. Here, gods and ancestors may have mingled, their forms indistinct, their names unrecorded. The offerings left behind do not speak their language, but they whisper of needs and hopes not so different from our own. The artifacts are countless, yet their meanings remain elusive. Some figurines are crude, others carefully shaped, suggesting that offerings came from all classes of society. The sanctuaries were not the exclusive domain of elites. They belonged to shepherds, farmers, artisans, and perhaps to palace priests as well. All could climb, all could lay a token before the stones. In this, the Peak Sanctuaries may reflect one of the most communal aspects of Minoan religion. Still, questions linger. Were these places visited seasonally, tied to the rhythms of planting and harvest? Did great processions climb together, or were offerings left in solitude? Were fires lit at night, their glow visible for miles across the valleys below? The absence of written testimony leaves us with silence. What remains are fragments, scattered figurines, altars scarred by time, and the wind that still sweeps across the peaks. In the late Bronze Age, many sanctuaries show signs of continued use even as the palaces below faltered. Knossos, Phaistos, all suffered destruction, yet the shrines upon the mountains endured. It may be that the people of Crete turned increasingly to these heights in times of crisis, seeking reassurance from gods who were older and more enduring than the fragile palaces of men. But even these sanctuaries would eventually fall silent, their altars buried by soil and snow, their figurines crumbled into the dust of the mountains. Today, to stand upon Mount Juctus or Phaistos is to feel that same vastness. The sea shimmers to the horizon, the plains spread like a tapestry, and the ruins of palaces lie quiet below. Nothing stirs in the sanctuaries now but the wind, carrying whispers of ancient hymns that once rose with smoke and prayer. What compelled the Minoans to climb again and again into these heights? Was it reverence for the gods of sky and storm, or a longing to see the island in its entirety, to touch the eternal face of the mountain itself? We cannot know. The peaks endure, their stones mute, their secrets folded into mist, and yet, as the sun sinks over Crete, the silhouette of each mountain becomes a shrine once more, silent, watchful, waiting. Chapter 17. Seals and signet rings. In the palatial ruins of Crete, amid storerooms and stairways, archaeologists have uncovered objects small enough to fit in the palm of the hand, yet powerful enough to guard identities, mark possessions, and perhaps channel the unseen world. These are the Minoan seals and signet rings. Fashioned from steatite, ivory, semi-precious stones, or even gold, they compress entire worlds into miniature form. At first glance, they are tools of administration, stamped into clay to secure jars, doors, and tablets. But to look more closely is to glimpse something else. Ritual, imagination, and myth, rendered on a scale so intimate, it seems designed for the private gaze of the wearer alone. The earliest seals on Crete appear in the 3rd millennium BCE, even before the rise of the great palaces. By the time Knossos, Phaistos, and Mallia flourished in the Middle Bronze Age, seals had become ubiquitous. Clay nodules, impressed with seal designs, have been found by the thousands, securing storerooms, shipments, and archives. They were signatures before the written word, marks of authority and authenticity. Yet unlike a simple geometric emblem, Minoan seals often carried intricate imagery. Lions and griffins stride across their surfaces. Women raise their arms in prayer before stylized shrines. Ships ride waves, trees sway in sacred groves, and dancers form chains of movement. Each impression preserved not just ownership, but vision. The material itself added meaning. Steatite, soft and easily carved, lent itself to early experimentation. Later, harder stones such as carnelian, agate, and rock crystal were used, their translucence catching the light in ways that made the engraved lines shimmer. Ivory suggested contact with distant lands, Egypt, perhaps Syria, and gold signet rings, some weighing more than any simple administrative tool would require, spoke of wealth, ceremony, and sanctity. To carve such a ring was to invest labor and artistry for something more than a practical stamp. The iconography is staggering in its variety. Some seals show simple heraldic creatures, lions, goats, or birds mirrored in symmetry. Others present scenes that seem to move, acrobats vaulting, warriors grappling, priests before altars. Still others dive into realms more dreamlike. Winged creatures stride beside humans, composite beasts, part lion, part eagle, patrol the tiny surface. Trees grow in impossible forms, their branches curling as though alive. It is as if these seals recorded a visual language parallel to the scripts of linear A and B, one equally dense with meaning, but never decoded. Perhaps most evocative are the gold signet rings of the late Minoan period. Some measure 3 or 4 centimeters across. Their elliptical bezels covered with finely engraved scenes. One famous example shows a procession of women before a shrine, their gestures frozen mid-motion, their hair and garments etched with astonishing delicacy. Another depicts a boat flanked by dolphins, the sea itself carved into the surface as a field of rhythmic lines. These rings were not meant to be pressed into clay repeatedly. Their fragility suggests they serve symbolic or ceremonial purposes. To wear such a ring was to carry an emblem of myth upon one's hand. What did these images mean to their makers? Some scholars have argued for mythic narratives, that the rings capture stories once told aloud, now forever lost. Others see them as depictions of ritual, libations poured, sacrifices offered, dances performed in sanctuaries and groves. Still others suggest they acted as talismans, invoking protection or fertility, ensuring safe voyages across the sea. Like Egyptian scarabs or Mesopotamian cylinder seals, they combined function with magic, administration with belief. Each impression into clay was at once a signature and a prayer. The precision of the carving is astonishing when one remembers their scale. Many seals measure less than 2 centimeters across. Under magnification, details emerge: strands of hair, ripples of water, tiny branches of sacred trees. It has led some to speculate that the Minoans possessed fine tools, perhaps bronze burins or drills, and an artistic tradition that passed from master to apprentice across generations. The seals are, in effect, miniature masterpieces, artworks portable enough to be worn around the neck, tied at the wrist, or hidden in a pouch. Archaeological context deepens the mystery. Seals have been found not only in palaces, but in tombs, shrines, and humble houses. Their distribution suggests they belong to many layers of society, not solely to elites. Yet the most elaborate rings and engraved stones come from burials of high status, where they may have functioned as emblems of identity carried into the afterlife. A seal buried with its owner became more than a tool. It became a legacy, sealing not jars but memory itself. There is also the question of secrecy. Some seal impressions appear only once, on a single piece of clay, as though the image was reserved for a specific ritual or moment. Others recur across multiple sites, suggesting that certain motifs were widely recognized. Were these images meant to be seen by many, or were they private symbols, understood only within a circle of initiates? The ambiguity lingers, leaving the modern observer to wonder how much of Minoan religion and myth pass through these tiny windows of imagery. Comparisons help, but only partially. In Mesopotamia, cylinder seals often depicted recognizable myths, the storm god battling monsters, kings before gods. In Egypt, scarabs bore royal names and symbols tied to cosmic order. The Minoan seals resist such certainty. Without surviving texts to explain their scenes, each carving hovers between clarity and enigma. A bull may signify sacrifice or fertility or celestial power. A dancing figure may be a worshipper or a goddess herself. The rings speak in a language that is both precise and impenetrable. Their very survival across millennia is striking. Made for the pressing of clay, their impressions endure when the clay itself has often disintegrated. Thousands of seals have been catalogued, their motifs studied, classified, and debated. And yet, after a century of scholarship, no consensus has emerged on their meaning. They remain, as one archaeologist put it, the intimate art of an unreachable world. To hold one today, or even to see its impression magnified in a museum case, is to feel a paradox. The image is so vivid it seems to speak, and yet its voice has been erased. We are left with fragments of a mythology only the Minoans fully knew, glimpses into rituals whose songs and chants have fallen silent. What stories once flowed from these rings and stones? Did they recount voyages, divine encounters, the turning of seasons? Or were they simply marks of trade, their sacred appearance disguising a purely practical role? The seals preserve their images, but not their meanings. Like a script without translation, they wait in silence, bearing witness to a civilization whose visions were carved into stone, and whose truths remain just beyond our grasp. Chapter 18. The Villa of Hagia. Triada on the southern slopes of Crete, where the land rolls down toward the Libyan Sea, lies a ruin both stately and enigmatic. Hagia Triada, the Holy Trinity in later Greek, bears a name given by monks centuries after the place had already fallen silent. Yet long before Christianity touched these hills, this villa, or palace, or shrine, stood as one of the most intricate expressions of Minoan architecture and art. It rose near the great palace of Phaistos, but never quite as its rival. Instead, Hagia Triada was something else: a residence, an administrative hub, a ritual center, perhaps all at once, or perhaps something stranger still. The site came to light at the dawn of the 20th century. Italian archaeologists, working in 1902 and the years that followed, began to uncover walls that stretched in tiers along the hillside. Unlike the sprawling labyrinth of Knossos or the monumental central court of Phaistos, Hagia Triada was more compact, almost intimate. Its rooms clustered around courtyards, stairways, and corridors. Some bore traces of frescoes, fragments of color that once shimmered on the plastered walls. Others held storerooms filled with pithoi, the great clay jars that stored grain, oil, or wine. Still others contained altars, benches, and shrines, spaces set aside for rites that are now only hinted at by the debris left behind. One of Hagia Triada's most striking features is its architectural ambiguity. Scholars hesitate to call it a palace, for it lacks the grand central court and monumental scale typical of Knossos or Mallia. Yet it is no simple house either. Its size, decoration, and administrative finds, including both Linear A and Linear B tablets, suggest it was a place where elites lived and ruled, where scribes counted stores, and where rituals marked the passage of seasons. Perhaps it was a royal villa subordinate to Phaistos, or perhaps it was something more independent, a ceremonial center that flourished in its own right. The frescoes discovered here deepen the mystery. One shows a vivid hunting scene, a boar, powerful and bristling, pursued by figures carrying spears. Another, now preserved only in fragments, depicts a procession of chariots, their wheels painted in motion, their drivers poised as though in eternal parade. Yet another scene reveals men bearing vessels, perhaps participating in ritual offerings. These images differ from the fluid, dreamlike art of Knossos, They feel sharper, more martial, almost prefiguring the Mycenaean aesthetic that would come to dominate Crete in the later Bronze Age. Was Hagia Triada already under Mycenaean influence when these frescoes were painted? Or did the Minoans themselves shift toward new forms of expression as their world entered its twilight? In the storerooms and archives of Hagia Triada, archaeologists found tablets inscribed in both Linear A and Linear B. This dual presence is extraordinary. Linear A, the silent Minoan script, remains undeciphered, whispering a language we cannot hear. Linear B, deciphered in 1952, reveals an early form of Greek, the tongue of the Mycenaean newcomers. That both scripts appear in the same complex suggests a moment of transition. Here, in the same rooms, scribes wrote in two languages, two worlds overlapping. The impression is of a society balanced on the edge of change, Minoan traditions enduring, but already shadowed by the arrival of mainland powers. Hagia Triada's wealth is best embodied in one extraordinary find, the painted limestone sarcophagus, discovered in 1903. Though already mentioned in earlier chapters, it bears recalling here, for it was found within this villa's grounds. Its painted panels show processions of musicians, libations poured, bulls sacrificed, offerings presented to the dead. The imagery blends Minoan grace with Mycenaean themes, funerary ritual entwined with seasonal renewal. That such an object was placed at Hagia Triada confirms its role not just as a residence, but as a site of ceremony, a place where the living communed with gods and ancestors alike. Among the smaller finds are seal impressions, figurines, and imported pottery. Vessels from Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt pass through Hagia Triada's halls, evidence of Crete's role in the great network of Bronze Age trade. In its workshops, artisans shaped stone, bronze, and ivory, leaving behind tools and half-finished objects. This was not an isolated hilltop villa. It was plugged into the currents of the Aegean and beyond, a node in the great seafaring web that bound Crete to distant shores. The villa's history is bound, too, to destruction. Like so many Cretan sites, Hagia Triada fell to fire in the late Bronze Age. Its walls blackened, its frescoes shattered, its storerooms collapsed. Some scholars link this devastation to the wider turmoil following the eruption of Thera, when earthquakes, tsunamis, and political upheaval shook the Aegean world. Others see it as part of the Mycenaean conquest of Crete, when mainland powers imposed new authority over the island's surviving centres. After its destruction, Hagia Triada was never fully rebuilt. The ruins remained, silent witnesses to a moment of transition, a chapter left unfinished. Today, walking among its low stone foundations, one feels both intimacy and unease. The rooms are smaller than those of Knossos, the courtyards narrower, the walls closer. Yet the richness of what was found here suggests power and ceremony. It is as if Hagia Triada was deliberately set apart, a place where administration and ritual mingled, where daily life and sacred performance blurred. Its dual scripts, its hybrid art, its sarcophagus painted with ritual scenes, all point to a society negotiating between continuity and change. What was Hagia Triada truly? Was it the retreat of a Minoan prince? A residence close to but apart from Phaistos' great court? Was it a sanctuary villa where seasonal rituals unfolded in view of the mountains and the sea? Or was it already a Mycenaean stronghold, built upon Minoan foundations but infused with new ideas, new language, new gods? The evidence allows all these readings, but none can silence the others. Perhaps that ambiguity is the heart of Hagia Triada's legacy. It is a place of mingling, where scripts overlap, where art shifts, where rituals straddle two traditions. It stands in the shadow of Phaistos, yet carries a voice all its own. It is not the beginning of Minoan glory, nor its full flowering, but its twilight, a liminal space where memory is both preserved and transformed. As the sun sets over the hills of southern Crete, the ruins of Hagia Triada catch the fading light. Stones that once held frescoes now stand bare, open to wind and silence. The villa does not tell us who lived there, or what prayers were spoken within its shrines. It leaves us only fragments, painted hunts, written tablets, a sarcophagus of ritual scenes. From these shards, we sense a world on the threshold, a civilization passing through shadow into the hands of others. Yet even in ruin, Hagia Triada resists clarity. It remains a crossroads, a place caught between what was and what would come. And in that uncertainty, its mystery endures. Chapter 19. The myth of King Minos long. After the palaces of Crete had crumbled, long after the storerooms had emptied and the scribes' tablets had turned to dust, the name of Minos lingered, not in stone inscriptions or clay archives but in story. To the Greeks of the classical world, Crete was not remembered for its frescoes or its labyrinthine halls, but for a king, half tyrant, half lawgiver, whose shadow stretched across both myth and memory. The figure of King Minos became the bridge between archaeology and legend, between what was once lived and what was later told. In the myths, Minos was the son of Europa and Zeus, raised by the gods themselves, and chosen to rule over Crete with the sanction of heaven. His power was marked by the sea. Poseidon sent him a magnificent bull, a sign of divine approval. Yet Minos' refusal to sacrifice the bull as promised sowed the seeds of disaster. From that breach came the birth of the Minotaur, a creature half man, half bull, born of Pasiphae, Minos' queen. To contain the monster, Minos turned to Daedalus, the master craftsman, who designed a labyrinth so intricate that none who entered could find the way out. Thus was born the most enduring image of Minoan Crete, the winding, maze-like halls beneath the palace of Knossos. The archaeological echoes are uncanny. Knossos, when unearthed by Arthur Evans in 1900, revealed corridors and stairways, magazines and chambers that seemed to turn upon themselves in disorienting sequence. Evans himself was quick to tie the ruins to myth, proclaiming that he had found the labyrinth of Minos. Frescoes of bull leaping further confirmed for him the mythic resonance. Here was the origin of the tales of bull contests, half remembered in the monstrous Minotaur. Yet myth and reality do not align so neatly. Was the labyrinth a story born from memory of the sprawling palaces? Or was it a metaphor, later imposed on ruins whose real meaning had already been forgotten? Greek poets and playwrights remembered Minos in many guises. To Homer, he was a great king, seated beside Zeus in the afterlife, judging the dead. To Herodotus, he was a naval power, the first to rule the Aegean with thalassocracy, dominion of the sea. To Athenian dramatists, he was a tyrant, demanding tribute of youths sent to their death in the labyrinth. In these shifting portrayals, the Greeks projected both admiration and fear. Crete was imagined as a cradle of law and order, but also as a place of cruelty, domination, and hidden darkness. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur crystallizes this ambivalence. Athens, the rising city of the mainland, is cast as victim to Crete's power. Each year, the myth tells, 7 youths and 7 maidens were sent as tribute to Knossos, sacrificed to the beast in the labyrinth. Theseus, aided by Ariadne and her fateful thread, braved the winding passages and slew the Minotaur, breaking Crete's hold over Athens. In this story, Athens emerges as hero, Crete as oppressor. Yet beneath the layers of drama lies a kernel of historical truth, that in earlier centuries, Crete was the dominant naval force, and mainland Greece was in its shadow. By telling of Athens' triumph over Minos, the Athenians reimagined their rise as both heroic and inevitable. Daedalus, too, belongs to the mythic memory of Crete, the craftsman, trapped by Minos after building the labyrinth, fashioned wings of wax and feathers for himself and his son Icarus. They took flight from the island's shores, escaping imprisonment, only for Icarus to fall into the sea when he soared too close to the sun. This story, retold for generations, casts Crete not only as a place of dominance, but of ingenuity and escape, a land of invention yet also of confinement. The myth reflects something the ruins themselves suggest, that Crete was a society both creative and bound, magnificent and fragile. Other myths drift along the edges of Crete's memory. Minos himself, some say, sailed each 9th year to the cave of Zeus on Mount Ida, where he received new laws from the god. In this, the Greeks remembered him as a divine lawgiver, a figure of order, even justice. Yet in the same breath, he was remembered as cruel, the father of monsters, a tyrant demanding sacrifices. This duality mirrors the way later cultures saw empire itself, glorious in power, terrible in domination. The question lingers, how much of this mythology is memory? Did the Greeks, centuries after the collapse of Minoan civilization, preserve in story some echo of what once was? The bull, sacred and feared, dominates both archaeology and myth. The winding architecture of Knossos recalls the labyrinth. Crete's naval power, glimpsed in the far reach of Minoan trade, surfaces in the stories of Minos' thalassocracy, and yet myth transforms fact into allegory. The Minotaur may be no memory of an actual creature, but a symbol of Crete's dominance, a monster that devoured its neighbors until they found the strength to resist. Beyond Greek myth lies another echo, Atlantis. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, tells of a great island civilization destroyed in a single day and night by catastrophe. Many have wondered if this is a veiled memory of Thera's eruption, when the flourishing towns of the Aegean were buried in ash and tsunamis swept across the sea. The Minoans, with their island empire and sudden decline, fit uncannily into the Platonic tale. Was Atlantis a memory of Crete and Thera, preserved in myth long after the details were forgotten? Or was it only allegory, philosophy clothed in story? What remains clear is that Crete, though largely forgotten in material memory, endured in myth. The Greeks, who inherited the seas once ruled by the Minoans, recast their predecessors into stories that fit their own world. Minos as tyrant to be overcome, as lawgiver to be revered, as judge of the dead to be feared. In myth, the Minoans were not erased but transfigured, their history turned into story, their memory refracted through the imagination of another age. Standing today before the ruins of Knossos or Phaistos, one cannot help but feel the pull of these stories. The stones whisper of administration, of trade, of ritual. The myths speak of monsters, heroes, and divine kings. Between the two lies a gulf we cannot bridge, yet both speak of the same island, the same vanished people. Was Minos ever real? Was there a king whose power gave birth to these legends? Or is Minos only the name myth gave to an entire civilization, remembered not as itself, but as story? The answer remains beyond reach. But in the myths of Minos, the Minoans live on, not in their own voice, but in the words of others. The labyrinth may be stone or it may be story, but either way, its corridors still lead us inward, deeper into mystery. The line between history and legend blurs, and in that haze, Crete endures. Chapter 20. Minoan Frescoes of Nature. In the palaces and villas of Crete, time has preserved a vision of the world not in stone, but in colour. On crumbling plaster walls, archaeologists found lilies stretching upward, dolphins leaping through waves, and flocks of birds suspended in endless flight. These images are the closest we come to seeing the Minoans not as rulers or warriors, but as dreamers. Through fresco, they recorded their universe in living pigment, a dialogue with nature painted across the surfaces of their most sacred and intimate spaces. Unlike the art of Egypt, which exalted pharaohs and gods, or that of the Mycenaeans, which favoured power and fortification, Minoan frescoes reveal a civilization whose eye turned toward the rhythms of land and sea. At Knossos, blossoms seem to quiver in a painted breeze, their red and saffron petals unfolding along palace walls. At Akrotiri on Thera, a port linked to Minoan Crete, whole rooms shimmer with dolphins gliding through bright blue seas. The frescoes, frozen for millennia under volcanic ash, capture a world vibrant with motion, where the natural world itself was given pride of place. Archaeologists first uncovered these scenes in the early 20th century, as Sir Arthur Evans dug through the palace of Knossos. The walls were fragile, fragments often no larger than a hand, but when pieced together they revealed something astonishing. Here were not lines of soldiers, not triumphs of conquest, but lilies in fields and monkeys climbing rocks. To Evans, and to generations who followed, these images seem to speak of a society in tune with its environment, and perhaps even with forces deeper than the eye could see. The lilies of Knossos are perhaps the most famous of these floral visions. Painted with a delicacy that suggests careful observation, they bloom across the house of the frescoes, in repeating patterns, their petals curling outward in rhythms of renewal. Scholars have wondered if they mark the passage of seasons, or if they served as subtle invocations of fertility, mirroring cycles of planting and harvest. In ancient myth, flowers often opened portals between mortal and divine. Persephone's descent into the underworld began with the picking of a blossom. Could the Minoans too have used lilies as symbols of life's fragile transitions? Equally striking are the animals that dance across Minoan walls. At Knossos, a procession of dolphins arches in perfect fluidity, their sleek bodies accompanied by smaller fish. The composition is alive with motion, a window into a sea teeming with energy. Crete was an island people, dependent on the waters for trade, sustenance, and connection. To paint dolphins was to honor the element that defined them. In later Greek mythology, dolphins were sacred to Apollo and Poseidon, and they appear as guides to lost sailors, rescuers of men thrown into the sea. Were the Minoans the first to bestow this sacred guardianship upon them, long before the myths were written? On Thera, in the buried city of Akrotiri, whole walls pulse with nature's abundance. One room shows monkeys, rendered in shades of blue, scaling rocky cliffs toward trees heavy with fruit. Their presence puzzles archaeologists, for no monkeys lived in the Aegean. Some argue they were inspired by exotic imports from Egypt, where sacred baboons were revered, or perhaps from distant lands the Minoans reached by ship. Others suggest they are symbolic, beings of liminality who bridge the human and the animal, the earthly and the divine. Painted in startling hues, the monkeys climb endlessly upward, as if chasing a secret meaning just beyond our reach. The spring fresco of Akrotiri remains one of the most extraordinary. Across its panels, red lilies and delicate swallows create a landscape alive with joy. The flowers bend as if in wind. The birds swoop mid-flight, their wings suspended in a pattern that feels both natural and carefully composed. The effect is not mere decoration, but immersion. Standing within the room, one is enveloped by a vision of perpetual spring, a cycle of life untouchable by decay. In a city later buried in ash, it is haunting to see how vividly the painters summoned the eternal renewal of nature. The Minoans used a technique known as buon fresco, applying pigment to wet plaster so that color and wool fused as one. This method, requiring speed and precision, ensured the images would endure, their hues still radiant after 3.5 millennia. Yet for all their technical mastery, what matters most is not preservation but intent. Why did a civilization, in an age of kings and empires, devote such care to flowers, fish, and birds? Some suggest the answer lies in ritual. The placement of frescoes often corresponded with ceremonial spaces, shrines, lustral basins, or rooms used for gatherings. The natural motifs may have been more than ornament. They may have been invocations, part of a sacred atmosphere where the cycles of life and the powers of the earth were honored. Others argue that the images reflect a worldview where humans were not conquerors of nature, but participants in its rhythms. A vision in sharp contrast to the martial values of their Mycenaean neighbors. And yet, even as we sense meaning, certainty slips away. The frescoes remain stubbornly silent. Without written explanation, we cannot know whether the dolphins symbolize protection, whether the lilies mark seasons, or whether the swallows sang of souls in flight. They may have been decorative, yes, but their persistence across palaces, villas, and distant islands suggests more. To paint walls with such vibrancy was to transform architecture into cosmos, to live within a world of symbols whose full code is now lost. We must also ask, what is missing? Few frescoes depict kings, warriors, or hierarchy. Instead, they show dancers, acrobats, animals, and fields in bloom. Was this a conscious choice, an erasure of violence from the communal imagination? Or do we see only fragments, while other, more martial images have long since vanished into dust? Archaeology offers pieces, but never the whole. The Minoan frescoes of nature remind us that art is more than representation. It is worldview, painted into space. Through them, we glimpse a civilization that looked outward, not inward, that found divinity in blossoms and waves, not in crowns and weapons. Their walls carried the pulse of the sea and the breath of springtime, ensuring that even in stone palaces, life unfolded in eternal renewal. But as with all relics of Crete, these visions end in mystery. The lilies bloom, yet we do not know for whom. The dolphins leap, yet we cannot hear their song. The swallows wheel, yet their flight patterns remain unread. In the silence of fresco and plaster, we are left with color without words, symbol without certainty, beauty suspended in time, carrying messages we no longer possess the language to translate. Chapter 21. The decline of the palaces. Around the middle of the 15th century BCE, silence began to spread across the island of Crete. One by one, the monumental palaces that had defined the Minoan world, Knossos, Phaistos, Mallia, Zakros, fell into ruin. Their painted halls, their storerooms of grain and oil, their shrines alive with ritual, were consumed by fire, shaken by tremors, or abandoned to the winds. Archaeologists mark this turning point around 1450 BCE. a date that has become the threshold between the brilliance of Minoan civilization and its slow eclipse. Yet behind the chronology lies uncertainty. Was this devastation the result of natural disaster, foreign invasion, or some more intricate unraveling from within? The archaeological record preserves the evidence, but only in fragments. At many palatial sites, thick destruction layers testify to violent ends. Charred timbers collapsed into storerooms. Ash and rubble bury once grand staircases. Earthquakes were not uncommon in the Aegean, and seismic activity may have shaken walls already weakened by centuries of use. But fire marks much of the destruction, a fire often too widespread to be explained by tremors alone. Some scholars see here the hand of war, a concerted attack by enemies, perhaps the rising power of the Mycenaeans on the mainland. Knossos alone survived the wave of destruction, continuing for another century as the island's dominant center. Its survival, however, does not speak of resilience in the old Minoan sense, but rather of transition. The Linear B tablets discovered there, written in an early form of Greek, reveal administration in the Mycenaean tongue. Here, in the heart of Minoan grandeur, mainland rulers had taken command. What had once been a uniquely Cretan world was now entangled with the mainland's warrior aristocracy, and its art, writing, and political structures began to shift accordingly. The pattern of destruction raises questions that remain unsettled. Was there a single catastrophic event sweeping the island clean in one terrible season? Or was the collapse staggered, one palace falling, then another, in a sequence of crises spanning decades? Radiocarbon dates and pottery sequences provide only approximate answers. At Phaistos and Zakros, the devastation seems synchronous, a sudden end to centuries of continuity. At Mallia, the picture is less clear, with rebuilding efforts suggesting cycles of damage and recovery before the final abandonment. Some researchers tie the destruction to the great eruption of Thera, the volcanic cataclysm that darkened skies and sent tsunamis rushing across the Aegean. If the eruption occurred closer to 1600 BCE, as some radiocarbon studies suggest, then it predates the palatial collapse by over a century. But if the eruption happened later, nearer to 1500 BCE, then its aftershocks, ashfall, famine, and flooding may have set the stage for Crete's decline. The debate remains unresolved, a reminder of how fragile our chronologies truly are. Others point instead to the Mycenaeans. Around this same time, their influence expands sharply across the Aegean. Mycenaean pottery appears in ever greater numbers on Crete. Their administrative practices, reflected in the Linear B tablets, infiltrate the old Minoan centers. And their iconography, weapons, chariots, scenes of battle, begins to appear in art that once favored dolphins, lilies, and dancing. Could it be that the destruction marks a conquest, a deliberate imposition of mainland power upon the island's older traditions? If so, it was not merely military, but cultural, a slow reordering of society, myth, and identity under new rulers. And yet, there is another possibility. Civilizations need not be conquered to collapse. Some historians suggest internal strains, overextension of resources, ecological shifts, or political fragmentation. The palaces were not only residences, they were administrative engines, managing trade, storage, and ritual across wide territories. If drought, famine, or social unrest disrupted the delicate balance, the system may have broken under its own weight. Fires, in this view, could be the work of rebellion, subjects rising against the elites who had ruled from labyrinthine halls. What we do know is that after 1450 BCE, the world of Crete was no longer the same. The frescoes of nature and ritual give way to scenes echoing mainland styles. The goddess with serpents and lilies is overshadowed by imagery of spears and horses. Linear A, the script of old Minoan administration, vanishes, replaced by the Greek Linear B. It is a cultural eclipse, where the unique voice of the Minoans fades, and their legacy is filtered through the Mycenaean lens. Walking among the ruins today, the silence is palpable. At Zakros, the eastern palace lies buried beneath landslides, its storerooms still holding vessels shattered in collapse. At Phaistos, grand staircases ascend to nowhere, their stones scarred by ancient flames. At Knossos, the partially reconstructed walls stand as ghosts of continuity. Yet even here, beneath the painted dolphins, the administrative tablets whisper in Greek, not in the lost tongue of the Minoans. The end of the palaces was not the end of Crete. Villages and sanctuaries persisted, and people continued to live upon the land. But the palatial system, that unique constellation of art, ritual, and architecture, dissolved. The Minoans, once masters of the sea, became part of a wider Aegean order dominated by their mainland neighbours. Their memory was not erased, but absorbed, transformed into myths of Minos, labyrinths, and monsters, half remembered centuries later by Greek storytellers. The fall of the palaces reminds us how fragile greatness can be. A civilization that once defined the Aegean world left behind little more than broken walls and scattered symbols. We can measure the layers of destruction, trace the pottery sequences, and catalogue the burned beams. But the lived experience of collapse, the fear, the violence, or the slow erosion, escapes us. Was it a night of fire that ended centuries of brilliance, or a long twilight of power waning until silence claimed the halls? As the sun sets on the Cretan mountains and shadows gather over the ruins, the stones seem to hold their breath. The cause of the collapse remains uncertain, the answers buried in soil and time. All we know is that the palaces fell, and with them, a world that saw divinity in bulls, in lilies, in the dance of dolphins. Their decline marks not only an archaeological horizon, but a mystery that still lingers, unresolved, in the quiet ruins of Crete. Chapter 22. Trade networks of the Minoans. The sea was the lifeblood of Minoan civilization. Surrounded by the restless waters of the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean, the people of Crete did not treat the sea as a barrier, but as a highway. Their ships carved paths across open horizons, carrying goods, ideas, and influence from shore to shore. To understand the Minoans, one must understand not only the palaces of Crete, but the networks of exchange that bound them into a world far larger than their island home. Archaeology gives us glimpses of these networks. Pottery made on Crete has been found in distant places, in Cyprus, on the coast of the Levant, and even in Egypt. The distinctive Kamares ware of the Middle Minoan period, with its thin walls and vivid flowing designs, has turned up in tombs and settlements across the eastern Mediterranean. These vessels were more than containers. They were carriers of prestige, evidence of the allure Cretan craftsmanship held for foreign elites. Conversely, imported objects flowed into Crete. Egyptian stone vases, Cypriot copper, and Levantine seals have been unearthed in Cretan contexts, each piece a fragment of a web of exchange stretching across seas. At Knossos on Crete's southern shore, archaeologists uncovered storerooms and shipsheds, a harbour complex that once welcomed vessels from afar. There, amphorae from Cyprus and the Levant lay buried in the sand, silent proof of sustained traffic between Crete and its neighbours. At Knossos and Mallia, weights calibrated to international standards show how closely the Minoans aligned themselves to shared systems of trade, a Bronze Age economy that was becoming increasingly interconnected. The goods exchanged were not mere luxuries. Bronze itself depended on copper and tin, metals not abundant on Crete. Copper came from Cyprus, and tin perhaps from Anatolia or even farther afield. Without these, the tools, weapons, and ornaments of Minoan society could not have been made. The island's prosperity, then, was tied not just to artistry or agriculture, but to steady contact with distant sources of raw material. The ships that carried grain, wine, and crafted goods outward returned with the very elements of survival. Minoan ships appear in art and seal impressions, long, sleek hulls with high prows and banks of oars. These were not clumsy vessels, but carefully engineered for speed and distance. Some depictions even suggest sails, harnessing wind as well as muscle. Such ships would have enabled both commerce and the projection of influence. Later, Greek traditions spoke of the thalassocracy of Minos, a dominion of the sea. Though the myth is layered with later invention, it may preserve memory of a time when Minoan fleets controlled the vital sea lanes of the Aegean. Yet with reach came risk. Maritime trade is fragile, vulnerable to storms, to shifting alliances, and to piracy. A fleet wrecked in sudden squalls could leave ports empty and storerooms bare. Raiders could intercept cargoes or threaten harbours, and when natural disaster struck, as with the great eruption of Thera, entire networks may have collapsed overnight, as ports were buried in ash and coasts ravaged by waves. For a society so deeply tied to the sea, the same element that sustained it could turn against it without warning. The role of Crete as a middleman in Bronze Age exchange cannot be overstated. The island sits at the nexus of routes linking the Aegean with Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia. Minoan traders may have carried not only goods, but also stories, symbols, and beliefs. The dolphin frescoes of Knossos recall Egyptian motifs, while certain cultic symbols show parallels with the Near East. Whether borrowed, shared, or transformed, these echoes suggest that ideas, like cargo, traveled along the same sea lanes, and yet, even as we reconstruct these networks, uncertainty persists. How much of this trade was controlled by the palaces, and how much by independent merchants? Were fleets state-run, commanded from Knossos and Phaistos, or did smaller communities also launch their own expeditions? The tablets written in Linear A and Linear B hint at inventories and accounts, but they do not yet speak with clarity about how commerce was organized. What we glimpse are fragments, lists of oil, grain, textiles, shadows of transactions across seas, the bureaucracy of a world whose lifelines we can only partly see. The reach of Minoan trade left deep impressions on others. In the tomb of Rekhmir, vizier of Egypt in the 15th century BCE, foreign tribute bearers are painted carrying gifts. Among them, some scholars believe are Cretans, distinguished by their flounced skirts and offerings of vessels. Whether as allies, traders, or subjects, their presence in such imagery underscores their role in the broader sphere of Mediterranean exchange. To the Egyptians, Crete was Keftiu, a place of seafarers, bringing exotic goods across the waves. But supremacy at sea is never permanent. As the palaces declined, so too did the networks they depended upon. By the later Bronze Age, Mycenaean ships seem to have dominated the same waters once plied by Minoan fleets. The balance of power shifted, and Crete became less the hub and more a participant in a network it no longer controlled. The same sea that had elevated it to prominence now carried the vessels of others. Today, when one stands at the ruins of Knossos or gazes out from the cliffs of southern Crete, it is easy to imagine the horizon once busy with sails. The echoes of those exchanges linger in the broken pottery, in the imported stones, in the faint inscriptions of seals. The Minoans lived not in isolation but in constant dialogue with distant lands, their civilization rising on the currents of commerce and fading as those currents changed. The sea gave them connection, wealth, and influence. It also carried uncertainty, fragility, and eventual decline. To trace the networks of Minoan trade is to glimpse both the brilliance and the vulnerability of a civilization built upon water. A reminder that the same waves which sustain can also betray, leaving only fragments washed ashore. Chapter 23. Atlantis and the Echo of Memory. In the dialogues of Plato, written in the 4th century BCE, a tale unfolds that has haunted imaginations for more than 2 millennia. It is the story of Atlantis, a great island civilization, wealthy, powerful, and proud, that in a single day and night of misfortune was swallowed by the sea. The narrative appears in the Timaeus and the Critias, not as mythic poetry, but woven into philosophical discourse, a parable of hubris, decline, and the fragile fate of civilizations. Yet for all its moral framing, the description is tantalizing in its detail. Atlantis was said to lie beyond the Pillars of Heracles, rich in resources, formidable at sea, and finally undone by catastrophe. From the moment the tale was recorded, questions have persisted. Did Plato invent the story as allegory, or was he transmitting a memory older than his own age? He attributed the tale to Solon, the Athenian lawgiver of the 6th century BCE, who, he claimed, had heard it in Egypt from priests at Sais. These priests, in turn, spoke of an island empire destroyed in cataclysm 9,000 years before. The distance in time is implausible, the geography obscure, yet the resonance of the narrative has proven impossible to dismiss. Among the many theories that seek to root Atlantis in reality, one has remained especially compelling: the possibility that Plato's tale preserves, however faintly, a cultural memory of the Minoans. The parallels are difficult to ignore: a seafaring civilization, flourishing on an island, wealthy from trade, devoted to artistry and ritual. A sudden destruction that struck with elemental force, and in its wake, stories of a world lost beneath the sea, preserved not by monuments alone, but by echoes in myth. On the island of Thera, modern Santorini, the earth itself bears scars of the Bronze Age cataclysm that may underlie Plato's story. Around 1600 BCE, the volcano erupted with unimaginable force. Ash fell across the eastern Mediterranean, darkening skies as far as Anatolia and perhaps even Egypt. Entire settlements, such as the town of Akrotiri, were buried beneath pumice and ash, preserved like a prehistoric Pompeii. The eruption was among the largest in recorded human history, its tsunamis striking coasts and harbours across the Aegean. If any event could give birth to a myth of a great island sinking beneath the waves, it was this. The eruption struck at the height of Minoan prosperity. Though Crete itself did not vanish, it surely felt the blow. Harbours were damaged, fleets destroyed, fields blighted by ash. Some scholars suggest that this disaster destabilized Minoan society, leaving it vulnerable to later Mycenaean ascendancy. Others see it as a trauma remembered in oral tradition, passed down in fragments until it reached Greek ears centuries later. In this view, Atlantis is not invention, but distorted memory, refracted through time and myth into Plato's tale. And yet, the parallels are imperfect. Plato describes an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar, far to the west, not in the heart of the Aegean. His Atlantis is said to be larger than Libya and Asia combined, far grander than Crete or Thera. Some take these as deliberate exaggerations, a philosopher's reshaping of dimly known events into moral allegory. Others argue that the account is wholly fictive, a narrative crafted to frame Athens as the ideal state by contrasting it with a decadent empire brought low by divine judgment. The debate over Atlantis thus becomes not merely historical but philosophical. Was Plato a transmitter of ancient memory or an architect of pure allegory? The answer remains elusive, but the fascination endures. Archaeologists, geologists, and seekers alike return again and again to the ruins of Crete and the caldera of Santorini, searching for correspondences between story and stone. Each fragment of fresco, each layer of ash, seems to whisper of a world both real and half-remembered. What makes the link between Atlantis and the Minoans so enduring is not only similarity, but the very nature of cultural memory. Civilizations fall, but fragments remain. Stories outlast the societies that first told them, reshaped by each retelling. Myths are vessels, carrying traces of truth across centuries, blurring fact and invention. The memory of the flood, the destruction of Sodom, the fall of Troy, all linger in texts shaped long after the events they describe. Atlantis may belong to the same pattern, a story that remembers something, though we cannot know precisely what. For the Minoans, art and architecture were their voice, but those voices fell silent when the palaces crumbled. Linear A remains unread, their language locked away. What survives are images, dolphins, lilies, spirals of blue, and the ruins of staircases that lead nowhere. Perhaps Plato's tale too is a kind of image, not a literal history, but a symbol, a way in which memory persists even when words fail. The image of Atlantis has only grown since Plato's time. Romans speculated upon it, Renaissance thinkers sought it, and modern explorers continue to chase it. Yet again and again, the gaze returns to Crete and Thera. The shattered caldera of Santorini, its cliffs painted in bands of ash, looks even now like a scar left by a lost world. The ruins of Akrotiri, with their frescoes of ships and landscapes, stand frozen on the edge of disaster, a civilization suspended in time at the very moment of erasure. These are the echoes that feed the legend, giving it form long after the facts have been obscured. What Atlantis represents, above all, is a reminder of fragility. Civilizations can rise, dazzling in wealth and artistry, only to be swept away by forces beyond their control. For the Greeks, Atlantis was a warning against hubris, the arrogance of powers who forget the limits imposed by nature and the gods. For us, the legend draws us to ask how much of the past has been lost. How many stories lie buried beneath seas or ash, remembered only in distorted echoes? When we stand among the ruins of Knossos or gaze into the blue void of Santorini's caldera, we are drawn into that echo of memory. Was Atlantis here, among the palaces and fleets of the Minoans, or was it nowhere at all, only a parable clothed in myth? The ruins do not answer, they simply endure, silent as stone, leaving us to trace patterns between story and history, between Plato's words and the broken remnants of Bronze Age Crete. Atlantis remains both nowhere and everywhere, a shadow that stretches across philosophy, archaeology, and imagination alike. And in its shadow, the Minoans remain, half remembered, half forgotten, their world lost, yet still living in the stories we tell. Chapter 24. Reflections at Knossos' throne room. At the heart of the labyrinthine palace of Knossos lies a chamber unlike any other. Its walls still breathe with colour, its silence still charged with presence. Here stands the so-called throne room, a space carved in stone and fresco yet cloaked in mystery. A single chair of gypsum dominates the room, set against a painted backdrop of griffins, their wings unfurled, their gaze eternal. Before it lies a shallow basin cut into the floor, a place that once held water, or perhaps ritual. When Sir Arthur Evans uncovered this chamber in the first years of the 20th century, he was struck by its apparent familiarity. To him, this was the throne of a king. He imagined a Bronze Age monarch seated upon the gypsum chair, his court assembled around him, his power framed by mythic beasts. The griffins, guardians of authority in later Mediterranean traditions, seem to affirm the interpretation. Evans, steeped in his own Edwardian world of empire and hierarchy, saw in the stones of Crete the reflection of a royal court. He christened it, accordingly, the throne room. Yet, as the decades passed, questions grew. The chair is small, too narrow for a man of imposing stature. The frescoes, though powerful, seem to frame not the authority of a warrior king, but something more elusive. And nowhere in the surviving evidence of Minoan society do we find depictions of enthroned kings. Instead, the imagery that endures from frescoes and seals emphasizes goddesses, dancers, processions, and ritual gestures. The throne of Knossos may not have belonged to a king at all. Some scholars suggest it was a ritual seat for a priestess, or even a symbolic throne for the goddess herself, present in ceremony though absent in body. The basin before the chair complicates the picture. Evans saw it as a lustral basin, a place for ritual purification by water, perhaps for those entering the sacred chamber. Others wonder whether it functioned as a reservoir, a reflecting pool, or even a symbolic portal to the underworld. Its placement suggests more than utility. It anchors the room in a kind of ceremonial choreography, as though actions performed here carried meanings we can no longer decipher. Around the walls, benches line the chamber, suggesting an audience or assembly. But what kind of gathering took place here? Was this a council chamber, where decisions were made in ritual form? Was it a sanctuary, where initiates participated in rites hidden from ordinary eyes? Or was it the stage of a recurring drama, part performance, part devotion, in which the chair remained empty, symbolizing a divine presence that could not be embodied? Each possibility hovers at the edge of understanding, unprovable yet tantalizing. The griffins themselves add layers of enigma. These composite creatures, lion's body, eagle's head, wings arched in vigilance, appear across the ancient world as guardians of treasure, as emblems of divinity, as liminal beings between earth and sky. At Knossos, they flank the throne, facing inward, their gaze drawn toward the absent figure who once sat between them. Were they protectors of royal power, or attendants to a goddess? Were they meant to evoke awe, fear, or reverence? The paint that survives, vivid in its red and blue, still glimmers with intensity, as if charged with a meaning that has not faded, though our grasp of it has. What is striking is not only the chamber itself, but its placement within the palace. The throne room is not grand in scale. It is small, enclosed, intimate. The corridors leading to it twist and narrow, reinforcing the sense of secrecy. Unlike the vast courts of Knossos, built for spectacle and processions, this chamber feels inward turned, a sanctuary of hidden rites. To step into it today is to feel the shift from the expansive to the enclosed, from the public to the sacred. The very architecture seems to lead us from the outer world into the heart of mystery. Over the decades, archaeologists have debated its meaning without resolution. The Mycenaeans, who took control of Knossos after 1450 BCE, may have used the space differently than the earlier Minoans. Perhaps the gypsum chair was once a seat of ritual power, later reimagined as a throne of kingship. Perhaps what we see is a palimpsest, layers of use and reinterpretation, each leaving traces but not clarity. The room resists a single reading. standing instead as a mirror of shifting perspectives. For visitors today, the experience of the throne room is powerful, not for what we know, but for what we do not. The chair, empty yet commanding. The griffins, frozen yet alive. The basin, silent yet suggestive. It is a chamber where absence speaks louder than presence, where silence carries weight. Standing before the throne, one feels both close to the Minoans and infinitely distant from them, caught in the tension between what endures and what has been lost. It is here, in this single room, that the contradictions of Minoan civilization crystallize. We see artistry without explanation, symbols without text, power without names. The palaces, the ports, the sanctuaries, and the myths all converge in this space, embodied in stone and pigment but veiled in ambiguity. The throne room becomes not just a chamber, but a metaphor for the Minoan world itself, vivid in fragments, silent in meaning, endlessly compelling in its refusal to yield. Evans sought to resolve the enigma with confident assertions, weaving a narrative of kingship and empire. Yet a century of scholarship has made the mystery deeper, not clearer. The throne room endures not as a solved puzzle, but as an unanswered question, a reminder that the past is not ours to command. We may reconstruct walls, trace frescoes, analyze pigments, but the rituals once performed here remain beyond our reach. And so, after journeying through the sweep of Minoan history, from harbors to sanctuaries, from frescoes to myths, we return to this chamber in the heart of Knossos. The gypsum throne waits in silence, its meaning suspended between interpretations. The griffins watch, as they have for 3,000 years, their eyes fixed on an unseen presence. The basin holds only emptiness, reflecting not water, but our own search for understanding. The Minoans remain with us in ruins and in memory, yet they slip from our grasp whenever we reach for certainty. Their story is both vivid and incomplete, a tapestry with threads missing, a song with verses forgotten. In the throne room, we stand before that paradox, confronted by a past that is at once tangible and unknowable. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Knossos' throne room, not to provide answers, but to remind us that mystery itself endures, that the ancient world, for all our excavations and theories, still holds spaces where silence is the truest witness, and that in the end, we are left not with conclusions, but with reflections, shadows cast on stone, echoes in a chamber, the enduring presence of an absence we cannot name.